Hey guys! Part 4 of WAF if Naruto passed the graduation exam on his first try. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 32, Tsunade Retrieval, Godame Hokage? Danzo snorted from his hiding spot as Jiraiya reacted to his fellow council members' offer exactly how he predicted he would. Considering the mutual antagonism they had going, he knew that Jiraiya's answer wouldn't have been half as polite as it had been if he'd been there alongside Sarutobi's teammates while they made the offer. As it was, the man's refusal was somewhat rude, as he seemed far more interested in staring at the hot springs than he was in being offered the position of Godame Hokage. That had been a deliberate slight though, since Jiraiya barely tolerated Koharu and Hamura, and didn't tolerate him at all. There had been a time that Jiraiya had tolerated him, but after a run-in with one of the root agents in which Jiraiya had been forced to kill that kid, that forbearance had rapidly melted away like snow on a hot summer day. Considering the fact that his petition to the daimyo had failed yet again, and the fact that the slippery little weasel had yet again sent a letter leaving the choice up to them rather than coming to Konoha where he could use Shusui's eye on him, it seemed that Tsunade would be the new Hokage despite the fact that she'd abandoned Konoha more than a decade ago. He had no doubt that Jiraiya would somehow make this so, even if he had to forcibly drag the legendary sucker all the way back to Konoha and chain her to the Hokage's desk in order to escape the position himself. It was just as well, since Tsunade was the more responsible of the two, if only marginally. The upside to this situation though was that he would be able to slip far more past Tsunade than he would Jiraiya. Jiraiya's choice of traveling companion on his journey to retrieve Tsunade was all too predictable as well. He'd seen the papers making the boy his apprentice shortly after they'd hit the Hokage's desk, and because the boy was Jiraiya's apprentice, the man couldn't not bring the boy along. That, and since the man preferred traveling alone since it called less attention to himself, it was fully expected that he would reject a team of ninja out of hand, since it wasn't as if the man wasn't capable of dealing with any difficulty that cropped up along the way. Now that that matter was settled, and that Jiraiya actually accepting the position of Godame Hokage as there was a small possibility of him doing so hadn't happened, it was time to get ready for the arrival of his new and most likely only marginally willing Hokage. As he overlooked the forest from a conveniently high point, Tenzo whistled as he saw the full devastation that had been wrought by the Kyuubi Jinchuriki's rampage. You could build a whole damn town complete with a couple outlying farms in the clearing the boy had created in what had once been a dense forest. Fortunately for Konoha, that clearing hadn't been swept through the middle of the village, as might have happened considering some of the other Jinchuriki rampages he'd heard tales of. People were understandably afraid of the power the boy wielded, especially the civilians who lacked knowledge of the shinobi arts, and saw them as being magic, or the closest thing to. Some of the more superstitious people who believed that Naruto was the demon he contained had come to believe that the Sandame had placed some sort of spell on the boy that had worn off when he passed. Others had come to believe that the Yandame's seal had broken, and in a way, they were right. The seal was indeed weakening, and would likely weaken even further every time the boy brought out the Kyuubi's power, but that was apparently intended to happen, considering how all of the other Jinchuriki tended to merge with their Biju during battle the way the Suna Jinchuriki had merged with Shikaku. The only question was if Naruto would be able to control that power or if it would control him. The reason he knew so much about Naruto's seal and the way it was intended to function was because he had gotten the information that backed up his assumptions about Naruto's seal when he'd done research on the Biju in order to learn how to contain and control them with the power he had gotten from Orochimaru's experiments with the Shodai Hokage's DNA. That was a matter for another day, however. Right now, it was time to get to work. Mokutan, Mori no Jutsu! He yelled as he slapped his hands against the ground and caused several dozen trees to grow. This was only a small start, however, and it would take him a while to finish, especially since he'd be growing houses in Konoha as well. If anyone had stopped and asked him, he would state that as for how he himself currently felt about Naruto's power, it was that he was annoyed at the amount of work the boy had made for him in the space of a single afternoon because of it. As he watched his young student, Baki briefly wondered what it had been that had caused Gaara to run for the toilet. One second the boy was studying a couple of books, and the next he was running for the bathroom. When he'd pressed his ear to the door, he hadn't heard the boy vomiting as he half expected him to be, but instead it sounded as if he'd been crying? Maybe not crying, but at the very least, he sounded rather upset, and not in the "Stop annoying me or I'll kill you" way. After his father's funeral, Gaara had demanded several books on Konoha history, and every bingo book that contained entries with the name Uzumaki in them. Based on the unusual requests, he guessed that the boy was doing research on the boy who had defeated him, which was rather unusual. But then again, since Gaara had never been defeated before, the whole situation was unusual. Since it seemed as if the situation with his student would hold for a while, he decided to investigate. Moving over to the desk to see exactly what it could have been that had upset the boy so badly, he noted that only 2 books were open out of a stack of 30. One was a rather dated bingo book from sometime during the Third Shinobi World War, and the other was a recent Konoha Ninja Academy history textbook. The Academy textbook was open to a page that contained a close-up view of the Yondaime Hokage, which looked like his last official photograph before he was appointed to the position. The bingo book was open to an entry for one Uzumaki Kushina nicknamed the Red Hot-Blooded Habanero. The Uzumaki woman was very attractive, and looked familiar for some reason. Maybe he'd faced her in battle when he was a genin, or during his early days as a chunin. Funny, it looked as if Gaara had traced 3 lines on each of her cheeks with the pencil that he'd been using to take notes. Of course, if you rounded out the chin a little bit, and changed the hair and eye color from red and gray to blonde and blue, and gave her a bit of a tan, she'd practically be the spitting image of the Uzumaki boy. Why would that upset Gaara though? No, it wasn't just that. 2 books were open. One to the picture of a woman from whom Gaara's opponent had gained his looks, and the other to the picture of a man who, now that he thought about it, had blonde hair, blue eyes though they'd been inexplicably changed to green in the Konoha history book, and a somewhat rounded chin. Oh freaking hell, yeah, that would give Gaara issues. Back in Konoha, Sakura had been eating a quick lunch after having helped her mother put things in order all that morning when Sasuke showed up out of the blue. Working on their home to make it reasonably presentable, if not presentable enough for the likes of Uchiha Sasuke, had been a task that had taken several days of working off and on. From the looks of things when they'd gotten home, some of the enemy ninja had trashed their place for the heck of it, and some Konoha ninja had caught them in the act at some point. Fortunately, they hadn't been stuck with the task of dragging the corpses of enemy ninja out of their home as one of their neighbors down the street had had to do, since someone had rather thoughtfully thrown them out of one or more of the windows for them. "What are you doing here?" she asked in surprise. Sasuke never showed up at her place, and since she'd spent the entire morning repainting the living room to cover the scorch marks from what looked to have been a battle that had taken place with one ninja standing on the now destroyed sofa and the other on the armchair, she hadn't had the time to fix her hair, much less dress herself properly. Sasuke said, then paused. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" she asked, somewhat startled. Sasuke had rarely if ever thanked her before. "For standing between me and Gaara during the invasion," Sasuke replied. "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "You're my teammate, and that's what teammates do for each other." Sasuke looked startled at this statement for some reason. She didn't know why though. If it had been her that was being attacked, Sasuke would have instantly leapt to her aid, right? Elsewhere in Konoha, Itachi sighed as he settled into his seat at what had been his favorite tea shop when he'd still been living in the village. He and Kisame had set out from the inn after he'd stripped off his disguise from the funeral the day before, and had arrived early that morning and had wandered around the village, looking for the Kyubi Jinchuriki. In reality, Kisame had been looking either that or he took the opportunity of his partner's absence to play hooky, and he had gone off to give his ultimatum to the council, ensuring that Sasuke would be safe for a while longer. He knew that he had some time to waste since he had little doubt that Naruto would show up at his apartment at some point that day, and he and Kisame could ambush him there if he couldn't find any way to get out of this. Seeing as he had nothing better to do, he was going to spend the rest of the day trying to find out where Naruto lives. Despite the fact that he was almost 100% certain that the boy was in the same apartment he had been in since before he'd left the village. He knew where it was because he had been on patrol in that neighborhood before, and had nearly gotten tagged by a water balloon that had somehow been filled with rotten eggs. He had little doubt that the balloon had been intended for the rather unpleasant ANB that usually patrolled the area during that shift, seeing as he'd done nothing to antagonize the boy prior to the event. As he and Kisame sipped their tea and prepared to eat their order of dango, 3 shinobi that he'd rather not face showed up. Asuma and Kurenai, who had apparently come on a date, and Kakashi, who had come to get some offerings for Obito and Ai, and was waiting for Sasuke. When Sasuke showed up, he and Kisame took the opportunity of the distraction he presented to vanish. As he hid on the roof of the tea house and waited for the shinobi to go off in pursuit of him and his partner, he heard Sasuke say, "Why aren't you bringing Naruto?" And Kakashi reply, "Because if Naruto hasn't left already, he will shortly be leaving the village to go on a trip with Jiraiya." Crap. That just made things a bit more complicated. Naruto had been about to go to Ichiraku Ramen and get lunch when Jiraiya had shown up and started talking some nonsense about going on a trip. At first, he couldn't believe what he was hearing, and was almost convinced that he was having an auditory hallucination or that someone had cast a prank genjutsu on him. What the white-haired pervert was saying had to be the most irresponsible thing he had ever heard. There was no way in hell that he would be going off and playing hooky with this guy when he had responsibilities here, and he most definitely did not owe the man for teaching him how to summon toads, even if Gamabunta may have saved his life during that battle with Gaara. "Let me get this straight," he said to the white-haired pervert. "Konoha's in shambles, and we're down by about half our ninja force due to all of the dead and injured, and you want me to go with you while you research some woman? That about sums it up, yes," Jiraiya said, smiling. "How about a screw in a you, and I'm getting back to work," he said as he turned to leave. On his way down the alley, he caught something that had been aimed at his head. When he examined the object, he found that it was what looked like a mission scroll. "What's this?" he asked. "Well, I hadn't wanted to make it official, but I will if I have to," Jiraiya said. "You're going with me whether you like it or not." "On whose authority?" he asked, not even bothering to open the scroll that could easily be a fake, considering the reputed sealing skills of the man standing before him. "That of Konoha's full emergency council," Jiraiya replied. Great. It seemed that they wanted him gone, temporarily at the very least. Well, it wasn't like it wasn't his fault. Losing control and setting the damn QB loose like that naturally had its consequences, and being dragged out of town for who knew how long by the white-haired pervert until things settled and a more permanent decision could be reached was obviously one of them, though he didn't think he was the best person to be with considering the fact that he'd actually tried to get him to use the QB's chakra before. "I'll go and pack," he snarled. "Cheer up," Jiraiya called after him as he walked off. "It's not going to be that bad. Besides, I plan on teaching you a thing or two while we're on the road." Shrugging and muttering, "Whatever." As he ditched the old pervert, he made his way to his apartment, and opened the scroll when he got there so he had a clear idea of what he should be packing. Apparently, he was being sent on a B-ranked mission to retrieve the Godame Hokage? Chapter 33, Tsunade Retrieval, Itachi. Naruto sighed as he trailed behind the white-haired pervert that he could be spending a long while with, considering the fact that the man didn't actually know where the new Godame Hokage was at the moment, and would have to hunt her down. When a shinobi of a Sannin's caliber didn't want to be found, well, at least they had a Sannin tracking her. As he trailed behind his team leader on a team that consisted of 2 people, him and the white-haired pervert, he wondered why the man hadn't told him that they were going to retrieve the Godame in the first place, and why he had pretended to be going off to party while Konoha was in shambles. After a while, he realized that it was because they could have been overheard, quite possibly by someone who could innocently let the information slip to the wrong person. If their enemies in Otogekure who had yet to make a second attack, or any other enemies for that matter, got this information, they could send out a team to assassinate their new Hokage before she reached Konoha, further weakening the village as the next candidate would not be as strong as her. The woman Tsunade, whom his brief research indicated was a healer of great renown, had been selected because she was the best for the job, both politically and in matters of strength. As the granddaughter of the Shodame and student of the Sandame, she would have almost universal appeal amongst the villagers. If something happened to her, the position would more than likely be given to the white-haired pervert, since he was both a student of the Sandame and the teacher of the Yondame. That would be an unmitigated disaster, because he was certain that the man's irresponsible behavior was not entirely a charade. An irresponsible Hokage was worse than no Hokage at all. Itachi suppressed an exasperated sigh. They had not managed to get out of the village before Asuma and Kurenai had caught up to them. Kisame was just itching for a fight, and he wasn't entirely sure he'd be able to hold him back. After introductions were made, and he looked into the eyes of his former comrades only to see that they wanted him dead, the fight was met, and he found himself involved in a small genjutsu battle with Kurenai. He merely turned the woman's genjutsu around on her, when even without the Mangekyo he could have done so much worse. Despite all appearances, he was still loyal to Konoha, and the shinobi of Konoha were still his comrades. He didn't want to kill them if he didn't have to. The battle continued for a little while, and eventually Kakashi showed up and pulled Kurenai out of a tight spot. He felt slightly sick at turning the Tsukuyomi against his former captain, but it was better that the man learn of it now from him rather than face Madara one day with no knowledge of its existence. While in the world of the Tsukuyomi, he couldn't go easy on the man even though he wanted to. If Kakashi suspected anything were up, he could do something to blow his cover. Kakashi would survive though, and wake up eventually after this was over. Sasuke had managed to do so without too much damage. But then again, children's minds were far more resilient than those of adults. When Mato Guy and some brown-haired jounin who bore something of a resemblance to that bastard Danzo showed up, he knew that it was time to leave. He didn't need half of Konoha's remaining shinobi on his and Kisame's asses, especially now when the Akatsuki's hunt for the Jinchuriki was beginning. Naruto was no longer in town, so remaining was pointless. Kisame growled as he and Itachi followed the host for the Kyuubi, and his guard at a discreet distance. He'd been robbed of what could have been the fight of a lifetime. Him against one of the former Guardian 12, Konoha's legendary green beast, and whoever the hell that was who came and assisted them. The fact that he didn't know who the brown-haired guy was and whether or not he was strong niggled at him for a while as he and Itachi pursued their target, until he finally broke down and pulled out his bingo book. Barely paying any attention to the road, he flipped through the pages looking for either the correct picture or a description that matched. Eventually, he found it near the back of the book and snorted with disgust when he did. The brown-haired guy was a rather standard Konoha jounin who only merited an entry in the book because of his skills as a con artist. There was a mention that he'd been using his genin team in cons recently. One of the genin on that team just so happened to be their target. If the little brat thought he could trick them and flee, he would be getting a very unpleasant surprise. Come to think of it, there was no reason that he couldn't cut the boy's legs off the minute he was captured to prevent such things. The boy didn't need legs to survive, and would need to be held for a while anyways until the group could get enough practice in to synchronize the extraction process. The newest member Deidara lacked the necessary concentration skills to maintain the jutsu for longer than an hour or so. Asuma sighed as he disarmed the last of Kakashi's traps and dragged the unconscious man to his bed. He had briefly thought of bringing Kakashi to the hospital, but decided against it. No shinobi liked to wake up in the hospital, and the hospital was so swamped right now that it was best not to go there unless it was serious. He would bring him there though if he didn't awaken in a few hours. Kurenai was commenting on the ingenuity of the traps surrounding Kakashi's door and windows. He had a feeling that Kakashi either hired the Uzumaki boy to do them or stole the boy's notes. One or two of them were rather effective classics that were meant to be noticed so one would become overconfident and miss the other traps until it was far too late. Guy was looking somewhat nervous, but he understood. Kakashi had been Guy's best friend as well as his eternal rival since the two of them were children, and was naturally Q1 concerned about him. Kakashi and Guy never mentioned the best friend part, but it was obvious to anyone who watched their interactions. Guy had graduated the academy a year and a half after Kakashi at the age of 7, and proven himself to almost be Kakashi's equal any number of times. People tended not to notice this, however, as Guy had always looked and acted like a loser. Many people had learned that Guy wasn't the loser he appeared to be the hard way after they'd had the shit beaten out of them by the gay-looking weirdo in green. As he sat discussing what had happened, and waiting for Kakashi to wake up, Kakashi's student Sasuke let himself into the man's apartment. From the look on the boy's face, it seemed that there actually was someone in Konoha that the boy cared about besides himself. He, Kurenai, and Guy remained quiet about Itachi. Who knew how the boy would react to discovering that his brother had returned, especially since the boy had mentioned swearing to kill his brother if he ever saw him again. It wouldn't do to lose the last of the Uchiha because they had let something slip and the child had gone off half-cocked believing he could defeat someone on Itachi's level. From what little action he'd seen from Itachi during that fight, he could tell that the young man had truly earned his S-class ranking in the bingo book. At the moment, Uchiha Sasuke was maybe ranked at a high C or perhaps a low B. While the boy had completed an A-ranked mission, that had been mainly due to Kakashi and an ungodly amount of luck. As Sasuke was asking Kurenai about Kakashi's condition, Yamashiro Aoba completely blew it. He'd shown up and started asking about Itachi and his objectives at what had to be the absolute worst time. Next thing everyone knew, the Uchiha boy was running out the room, and he had a feeling that it wasn't to go and have a good cry. Someone should go after him, Kurenai said. Anyone feel like they're up to dragging a struggling Uchiha with an activated Sharingan back and holding him captive for however long it takes for him to calm down and the situation to blow over? He asked. Everyone looked at each other waiting to see who would make the first move. That's what he thought. Things like this had been so much easier when there were other Uchiha around to deal with their wayward offspring. Guy sighed. He'd drawn the short straw, and would now be hunting down a highly upset Uchiha who was more than likely heading straight towards the enemy. The enemy in this case was Uchiha Itachi, and some large blue guy who had come to Konoha to kidnap the Uzumaki boy. While he was reasonably certain of the Uchiha boy's intended destination, he did a quick check of the village to make sure the child hadn't run off to have a panic attack somewhere. After all, it wasn't entirely inconceivable that he would do so, considering the number Itachi had done on him when he was 8. He barely suppressed a frustrated sigh when a quick interrogation of the gate guards had revealed that Sasuke had run out of town and down the road. Great. He knew that it wouldn't be as simple as crawling into whatever space the Uchiha child had holed himself up in and comforting the boy. Hopefully the child hadn't gotten too far in the head start he'd been given, and he would be able to catch up soon. Uchiha were made for speed, however, so things didn't look good in that area. A Uchiha who was desperate, and given the head start Sasuke had been given, could already be halfway to Shakuba by now. Well, if he failed to catch Sasuke in time, he would do 5,000 sit-ups then 5,000 push-ups while he waited for Kakashi to kill him. That man had been in Konoha. That man had been in Konoha targeting his teammates. That man had been in Konoha targeting his teammates, and he'd hurt Kakashi. That man had been in Konoha targeting his teammates, he'd hurt Kakashi, and now he was going after Naruto. When had Naruto become Naruto to him? Naruto had left town with someone called Jiraiya on some sort of trip, and they didn't know Itachi was after them. He didn't entirely know why that man was after them. All he knew was that that man had taken out their family to test his abilities, and now he was going after his teammates. Was it to test his abilities as well? Kakashi was said to be at something approaching Kage level, and Naruto was incredibly powerful, especially when he called on the power of the Kyuubi. Why come now though? Both Naruto and Kakashi had the same amount of power that they had a month ago, 6 months ago, a year ago even. The only thing that was different was that Konoha's security was at an all-time low thanks to the invasion, making it easier to slip in and out of the village without being noticed. If you didn't want to be noticed, however, why attempt to kidnap someone like Naruto whose absence would be quickly noticed despite the number of people who tried to pretend he didn't exist, much less start a battle with Hatake Kakashi in the middle of the village? It didn't make sense. Nothing about that man made sense, however. He would make it to Naruto in time, and warn him before he faced that man. Today, he would either kill that man and avenge the clan, or he would die. It was quite likely that he would die, and if he did, he would do anything in his power to take that man down with him. Luck was a part of a shinobi's skill set, and no matter how powerful a ninja was, they could still be brought down by a lucky shot. He would do his best to make that shot. Chapter 34, Tsunade Retrieval, Turning Point. It figured. Naruto thought. The instant we get into town, the first thing Jiraiya does is go after some hooker. God, I'm glad that they didn't choose him to be the Hokage. As soon as they had gotten to Shakuba, which was an inn town that was close to Konoha and therefore had a large number of travelers from all over, the first thing the white-haired pervert had done had been to book them a room in one of the numerous inns and go chasing after the first hooker that smiled at him, leaving him to haul their stuff to their room. Trudging up the stairs with all their stuff had not been fun, especially considering how heavy Jiraiya's pack was, even though it was half filled with storage scrolls. He'd just been getting settled and had been going down for a nap when there was a knock at the door. When he answered it, he found himself looking up into a pair of Sharingan eyes. The next thing he knew, he was out in the hallway and there was this large blue guy talking about chopping off his legs. Crap. The damn bastard that he was almost 100% certain was Itachi had trapped him in a genjutsu without him noticing. Why was Itachi messing with him though? At least he thought it was Itachi. The man bore a striking resemblance to Itachi's entry in the bingo book. There was still the faint possibility that it was the bastard offspring of one of the Uchiha, despite the fact that he was wearing a Konoha Hittite which had been scratched to indicate that he wasn't affiliated with the village any longer. It wouldn't be the first time that someone had tried to cash in on the reputation of a relative they bore a striking resemblance to, however. As he prepared to flee since he knew he was no match for the likes of Uchiha Itachi, Sasuke came into the hallway. The instant he saw Itachi, the worried look on his face fell away and was replaced by an expression of utmost hatred. An almost impossibly fast time later, there was a Chidori in Sasuke's hand, and he was racing down the hall towards Itachi. The attack never connected, however. Itachi had grabbed Sasuke's arm and deflected the attack. As he prepared to fight in order to free his teammate from the other man, Itachi broke Sasuke's arm. Itachi's companion obviously saw him readying himself to attack, because the next thing he knew, there was a sword swinging in his direction. Before he could dodge, the sword was deflected by a sizable toad. When he turned around, it was to see Jiraiya holding the hooker, who was now unconscious, and making a scene. Sasuke lay on the floor trying to recover. A broken arm wasn't a sort of thing that you got over after a few seconds, and got up fighting. The pain alone. The white-haired man who was called Jiraiya was talking about how putting a genjutsu on the unconscious woman he was holding in order to separate him from Naruto was a dirty trick, and how Naruto was that man's target. That man then said that capturing Naruto was the Akatsuki's #1 priority. Why? Why was capturing Naruto the Akatsuki's #1 priority? Who were the Akatsuki anyways? Oh. Of course. Duh. He knew the answer to one of the questions already. They didn't want Naruto per se, they wanted what he contained. They wanted it in order to set it loose on Konoha or any other village. With the power of the Kyuubi, they could hold entire nations hostage. Whoever they stood to gain a great deal if they managed to capture Naruto. Naruto's companion Jiraiya spoke of dealing with both that man and his partner. In that moment, his hatred overcame his pain and his common sense. That man was his to kill. He'd sworn that he'd kill that man, and he wouldn't let anyone else do so. "Butt out!" he yelled as he managed to force himself to his feet. "This is my battle!" Oddly enough, Jiraiya complied with his demand. He'd sworn he'd kill Itachi. He'd spent every day of the last 5 years planning this. He dreamed of this at night when he wasn't having nightmares of the day his clan had died. This day had come at last. He raced towards that man, hoping to get a lucky shot, and since he was unable to do any jutsus due to his broken arm, he was kicked back. He raced forward again, and was kicked back once more. Naruto moved to help him, but Jiraiya held him back after he'd yelled that he didn't need any help. Despite the fact that he was getting the shit kicked out of him, this was still his fight, and he would see it through, to the bitter end if need be. In the end, he proved to still be far weaker than that man. That man easily defeated him, and beat him to near unconsciousness. As his vision was fading out, that man grabbed him by the throat and slammed him against the wall. "You are weak," that man said. "Do you know why you are weak? It's because you lack hatred." That man closed his eyes, and when he reopened them, they were different. He knew what was coming next. He'd experienced it once before, on the night his clan had died, and he'd been left alone. As the world started to warp around him, he found himself thinking that he hadn't lacked hatred. In fact, just about the only thing he'd felt since setting eyes on that man again had been hatred. It had been his hatred that had put him in this position, as it had overridden his common sense and his situational awareness. The instant that man had deflected his Chidori, he should have known that something like this would happen. As the sky turned red, he saw bits of his life flashing before his eyes, bits that weren't part of the genjutsu that looked like it was going to be a rehash of the massacre. It was strange what came to you near the end. He found himself remembering that boy Haku from Wave for some strange reason. "I believe that you become truly strong when you have someone precious to protect," said the exceedingly feminine boy who had woke him up. Who was right? The boy he had fought against in Wave, or that man who had proven strong enough to destroy his entire clan on a whim? Had he been weak because he lacked hatred, or because he wasn't fighting to protect someone else? It had been his desire not to lose anyone else to that man that had lent him the speed necessary to get here before that man could cart Naruto off. When he saw that man, however, all of that had gone out the window along with everything else. He'd refused all help, and as a result of his wild actions which that man had easily countered, he had ended up back here, back in this world where his family was being slaughtered, and there was nothing he could do but watch. He felt the terror he had felt that night, the first time he had seen this horrifying world where his family was killed around him. He saw every expression of horror, of betrayal, of determination as members of the family who hadn't picked up a weapon in years faced his brother in order to protect their families, and fell to that man's might, the might of the Mangekyo Sharingan, the cursed eyes you had to kill someone close to you to obtain. Even old man Masaichi, who could barely walk, had faced that man in a futile attempt at protecting his family. Old man Masaichi, who had shown more strength in that moment than at any other time he could remember. Old man Masaichi, who had run despite the arthritis and the bad leg. Old man Masaichi had become strong, but not strong enough. None of them had been strong enough. That man had caught them by surprise and used that moment of surprise, that moment of hesitation where the family couldn't believe that it was one of their own doing this to kill them. On more than one occasion early on, relatives drawn to the screams had come, seen Itachi, and died believing that he'd been there to help defeat the person who was doing this. They had been like fish in a barrel because one of the ones that should have been protecting them had chosen to slaughter them instead. He remembered that night, the night he too had felt that same betrayal as if it were last night. That night that his brother had revealed himself to be the monster who had slaughtered their family on a whim to test his ability. He hadn't done it out of hatred or malice, he'd done it because he was bored. He'd been strong, stronger than everyone else in the clan, and he'd proven it. There had been many bodies littering the ground of the Uchiha district to attest to that fact. He remembered the fear, the running, the screaming, the begging, the tears. That's right. That man had been crying. He'd run in fear, knowing he was no match for his brother, and at the last moment when it looked as if he were going to die, his Sharingan had activated. When his Sharingan had activated, he turned around and fought. It hadn't been enough, however. He'd been easily defeated and that man had fled. Strangely enough, there had been tears in his eyes as he did so. Why had he been crying though? There was nothing the sort of person who would kill his own family just to see how strong he was could be sorry for. That man had told him before he fled the night he'd killed the clan that in order to defeat him he should run and cling to life, hating him all the while, and not come back until he had eyes like his, the Mangekyo Sharingan. In order to get the Mangekyo Sharingan, he would have to kill someone close to him, someone he cared for, someone who cared for and trusted him. He would have to see the betrayal in that person's eyes as he or she fell to the ground dead the way the members of his clan had. He would have to become like that man. Was avenging the clan worth becoming another Itachi? A year ago, he would have unhesitatingly said yes. Heck, 6 months ago even. Hell, even a month ago. But now, as he stared at the betrayed faces of the members of his clan, he found himself hesitant. He wasn't sure if he should be hesitant though. If he survived today and got another chance, he would do it for them. He would become just like that man for them, but on a much smaller scale. Then what? Where would he go from there? Those who slay their comrades were on almost the same level as those who killed family. If he went through with it and killed someone to attain the Mangekyo Sharingan, he would never again be welcome in Konoha. He needed to be in Konoha to restart his clan though. He needed to be in Konoha to fill the compound with his descendants. He wouldn't be able to do that if he killed another of Konoha's citizens, especially if he did it for something like the Mangekyo Sharingan. Little brother, are you not watching? I don't think you are. I can fix that. Suddenly he was strapped to something so he couldn't flee even though there was nowhere he could run to in this place, and his eyes were forced open. The killing started again. And again. And again. And again. Eventually, after what seemed like forever, the world finally went dark. As soon as they were far enough away from the inn, Itachi split up from Kisame, found a bush, and emptied his stomach all over it. He hated doing that to his younger brother, but Sasuke needed to be strong. Sasuke needed to be stronger than him, because there was another who wouldn't hesitate to destroy him when he was gone, someone who was almost impossibly strong, someone whose power could put a Kage to shame. He would do whatever it took to make Sasuke strong, even what he had just done. Sasuke was a rather single-minded person. He had been since he was a small infant. Once he had a goal, he stopped at nothing to achieve it. What he'd done to Sasuke during the Tsukuyomi was give him a fresh reminder of his goal. As time causes people to forget certain things such as the pain of loss, Sasuke would rise from this twice as determined, and become more than twice as strong because of it. He himself didn't have to like doing it, but it had to be done. In a way, forcing Sasuke to witness the massacre of the clan had been as much of a punishment for himself as it had been torture for Sasuke. He would never forget what he had done, but every once in a while he needed a reminder of what it had been that he'd sacrificed and why. Chapter 35, Tsunade Retrieval, Rasengan. Naruto felt doubly determined to retrieve the new Godame Hokage after Guy had informed him of Kakashi's current condition and made his request. It seemed that the man wasn't certain that the medics at the hospital would be able to help Sasuke and Kakashi, who had also fallen victim to Itachi's genjutsu. How the man had come to this conclusion, he didn't know. It was possible that the medics had said something along those lines while Kakashi was being examined at the hospital. Tsunade had made a name for herself outside her position as one of the Sannin as a top-flight medical ninja. It was said that none could match her skill in the medical field. Konoha needed her now. Most importantly, one of his precious people needed her now. He would bring her back, or he would die trying. Despite the somewhat dismal situation, Mato Guy was almost as cheerful as always. It was almost relieving to have just a little bit of normalcy in his life after what had happened recently, even if it was the dork that constantly spouted off about the flames of youth. He accepted the jumpsuit from Guy in the spirit it was given, as an acknowledgement of his existence and an offer of friendship. After seeing the look on the white-haired pervert's face when he received the rather tacky garment, he had almost been tempted to wear it throughout the entire trip. Almost. He would be saving it for when he ran out of clean laundry. That, and the moment it would be most embarrassing for the white-haired pervert to be seen with someone wearing such a thing. He and Jiraiya walked for a while until they reached another town. There was a festival of some sort going on when they reached the town, and Jiraiya sent him off to play. On the surface, this seemed rather irresponsible, but beneath that was something else. While the festival was going on, people from all over the region would be coming into town and widening the pool of information Jiraiya could gather. Sending him off would allow Jiraiya to go places that didn't allow children, and meet with recalcitrant contacts who would not speak in his presence. Beneath that was the surface, however, and the possibility that Jiraiya would be off playing some adult games. There was no reason why the man couldn't do both while they were here, especially if the search for Tsunade was going to take as long as Jiraiya seemed to think it would. Jiraiya had rather greedily looked at his wallet, which contained his savings from several missions, and had actually tried taking it by bullshitting him about the 3 shinobi vices, when he'd made the mistake of pulling it out of his pack in his presence. He managed to keep Gamachan and its contents safe, however. He'd already had the lecture on the 3 vices from Tetsuo sensei, and as he hadn't borrowed the money or stolen it from an ally, there was no problem there. It was his to spend however he pleased, and donating it to the white-haired pervert's hooker and booze fund didn't please. Jiraiya had then tossed him his own pack with some line about the toads being able to find it if he got lost, and turned him loose. Understanding the need for downtime, especially in stressful times, he took the opportunity he'd been given. While he was still sad about the old man and the state Konoha was in, he wasn't about to wallow in misery, as there was no point in doing so. He would follow the old saying, "Live while you can. You can die at any moment." That was part of his nindo, which included, don't go back on your word unless there is absolutely no way you can fulfill the promise you made. Even though he did his best to live while he could, there were still days when he was overwhelmed. Today fortunately wasn't one of them, despite the fact that one of his teammates had been injured on his watch, and one of his precious people was badly injured. It was strange, really. He would have thought that if something like that had happened, he'd be having another one of his bad days, as Konohamaru called them. Perhaps he'd finally learned to deal with such things, as the others had said he would. Perhaps it was the distance between him and the situation making it seem less real to him, and therefore less painful. Guy had been the one to carry his injured teammate back this time. Perhaps it was the jovial atmosphere that was elevating his mood. Everyone here seemed happy, and nobody was giving him that look. That look was always worse on the bad days. The festival looked like a great deal of fun, and he planned to enjoy it the best he could. There were booths with everything from food to balloons, and a wide variety of games of luck and skill. There was even a puppet show that was detailing a ninja battle, and he could almost swear that he recognized the ANBU puppet. After stuffing himself with a little of everything, he started on the games. While he couldn't use ninjutsu, he could use his training some of the chakra control exercises he'd learned over the years to his benefit if he was discreet about it. As long as an off-duty or retired ninja didn't rat him out, he should be fine. Eventually, after he'd played every game available and watched one showing of the puppet show from the beginning, getting a good laugh over what was apparently a comedy rather than a fight, he went to the grilled squid stand and got something for Jiraiya, since he was almost certain that the man was getting his fill of booze rather than food, whether or not he was actually working like he was supposed to be doing. In the time he'd known the man, he'd struck him as a borderline alcoholic. Actually, he was almost certain that the man really was an alcoholic. It was a common enough affliction amongst shinobi that it barely rated commenting. Career shinobi like Jiraiya were much more likely to die in the field by the age of 35, rather than of, say, liver failure at the age of 50 or so. When he finally found Jiraiya, The man who had holed himself up in a bar somewhere had finally lost his patience with some wannabe mob boss who had been hassling him over a serving girl, or something. Using a rather unusual jutsu that he didn't recognize, Jiraiya knocked the man into next week, destroying one of the balloon stands that littered the town in the process. "Hey Jiraiya, I bought you some squid," he said when the man finished apologizing and paid for the damages using the wallet that the wannabe mob boss had handed over. "Thanks," Jiraiya said as he stuck the adult-size fried squid on a stick in his mouth as he grabbed the bags of water balloons and balls that the stall owner had salvaged from the wreckage. As they turned to leave, he could have sworn he'd heard the wannabe mob boss say, "Oh God, he's training another one." They made their way out of town, and Jiraiya informed him that he would be spending the afternoon teaching him the jutsu he'd used on the wannabe mob boss, which was called the Rasengan. He watched as Jiraiya combined elements of the two basic chakra control exercises, tree climbing and water walking, to burst one of the water balloons that he'd carried away from the shattered stall. He watched this closely as he was certain that it could not be quite as easy as it appeared. Fortunately, he possessed some sort of talent or extreme good luck that had allowed him to get some of the higher-level jutsus in a much shorter amount of time than was expected, and that had been before the Kage Bunshin were taken into account. Kakashi had been amazed at the speed in which he'd learned the Kage Bunshin a couple years ago. The man hadn't expected him to get it in the week that he'd allotted for the task, and instead, he managed it by the morning of the third day. He'd spent the rest of the week finding out exactly how many Kage Bunshin he could summon. He'd hit about 1,000 before he nearly killed himself with chakra exhaustion. With his Kage Bunshin, he could learn things that could take other individuals months or even years to learn in a much shorter period of time. He was almost certain that he'd gotten the wind element mastered, but he wasn't 100% so, as he hadn't been able to spend much time with another wind affinity. Asuma was rather busy with his own team, and he didn't know anyone else with that affinity, which was rather rare, especially in Fire Country where the main affinity amongst the ninja is fire. The reason why the main affinity for ninja in Fire Country is fire was the same reason the main affinity in wind is wind, and water is water, and so on, is because shinobi with that such affinities tended to group together in the countries that bore that name, creating a wider gene pool for that affinity. The reason this seems to have happened, according to the study he'd read, was that each country had an environment where a particular affinity would be slightly more useful. In Wind Country, a wind affinity could be useful in creating a wind to counter the wind of a sandstorm, creating a protective barrier that kept the flying sand from flaying you alive. In Earth Country, the earth affinity could allow a user to create usable farming soil out of what had previously been a couple inches of dirt over about 100 feet of bedrock, or to burrow away from the hot sun. Fire Country had been mostly forest before it was torn up by centuries of war, and had become forest again after Konoha had been built. In such an environment, fire was useful for clearing out underbrush and controlled burns, as well as creating an instant campfire. All elements were of course useful in battle. "Can I use Kage Bunshin for this?" he asked Jiraiya. Tetsuo-sensei had agreed with Kakashi that as long as he was working alongside his clones, it would be fine to use them to learn new things. If he tried to run off to play again, Tetsuo-sensei would come down on him hard. The punishments Tetsuo-sensei could devise were things that he would do his best to avoid. "Sure, why not?" Jiraiya said as he settled himself against a nearby tree. "Thanks," he said as he summoned about 100 Kage Bunshin and set about trying to figure out how to pop a water balloon by rotating his chakra. Jiraiya looked slightly amazed by this for about half a second before he went back to his sake. Even though people already knew about the 1,000 Kage Bunshin incident, they were still quite surprised when he summoned more than about 10 Kage Bunshin at a time. Jiraiya's reaction was quite tame compared to some. Madogai sighed as he settled himself next to Kakashi's bed. Lee, who had been injured during the invasion, and Niji, who had been further injured when he went to retrieve his cousin who had been kidnapped during the invasion despite the fact that he wasn't up to full strength, were both already out of the hospital. Lee would be on leave for a while since he'd managed to break his leg in several places, nearly shattering his tibia. The medics, who had been swamped and rather pressed for time, had considered amputation, but fortunately for his student who had been unconscious at the time, he'd nixed that idea. He'd been out retrieving the Uchiha boy when Asuma's summon had come and informed him that they had taken Kakashi to the hospital, and that the medics hadn't been able to do more than put Kakashi in a bed and hope he woke up on his own. If Kakashi did wake up, his mental state would be uncertain. People who suffered through particularly traumatic genjutsu sometimes suffered breaks from reality, and would withdraw into their own little worlds to protect themselves. It might take years of intensive therapy and treatments with the Yamanaka the hospital had on hand to bring Kakashi back to the person he had been only hours ago. The Uchiha boy would most likely be in the same state, as he had suffered from the same technique. He hoped that Jiraiya and the Uzumaki boy would bring Tsunade-sama soon. The longer this continued, the worse the prognosis would become. Tsunade was a legendary medic, and it was said that she could cure almost any ailment under the sun. That wouldn't do Kakashi and his pupil any good, however, if there was nothing left to cure. While he waited for Tsunade to come, he would have to hold to the two things that had gotten him through every difficult situation so far: patience, and the faith that things would improve. "Kakashi, you better get well. If you don't, I don't know what I'll do," he said. Despite that annoyingly hip attitude, you've always had my back, and I should have had yours. Chapter 36, Tsunade Retrieval, Finding Tsunade. It had taken Naruto a day and a half to figure out how to spin the water in the water balloon in order to get the balloon to burst the way Jiraiya had. One of the clones had discovered it almost accidentally. What had happened was that he had tried spinning the water one way, and then tried spinning the water another way. The clone had rapidly switched from one direction to another, and noticed a peculiar disruption. When he rapidly switched back and forth again and got the same disruption, he tried rapidly changing directions. Eventually, the balloon burst. Apparently the trick was to either swirl his chakra about in different directions all at once, or to change directions so rapidly that it seemed that he was doing so. He would try both when he did the second step which Jiraiya had described. It took him nearly a week to master the second step, and during that week, Jiraiya spent his days interviewing several contacts as well as a bunch of random travelers who had come to the town for the 2-week-long festival, and spent his evenings drinking and getting serviced by hookers. He was starting to doubt that Jiraiya had ever been with a woman that he hadn't paid for. Eventually, after hours and hours of hard work, one of his clones had managed to burst the rubber ball that he'd been given. A few hours later, he was able to consistently replicate that feat. Jiraiya then introduced him to the third phase of the jutsu, the one that would complete the Rasengan. It would take a great deal of work, but he would get it eventually, and long before the 3 years it had taken the Yondaime to create the jutsu had passed. It always took much longer for someone to create a jutsu due to all of the trial and error involved than it did to learn one that had already been created. All of the pain he had undergone learning this jutsu, and all of the Kage Bunshin that had been sacrificed would be worth it in the end. Jiraiya sighed. While he knew more about the Akatsuki and Oto's current movements thanks to several contacts, he'd gotten absolutely zilch on the Tsunade front. Tsunade had always been good at hiding. The information he'd gained on the Akatsuki was little more than garbage. Apparently all that his contacts knew was that several of the other hidden villages had hired the Akatsuki to do the sort of wet work that Danzo's little organization did for Konoha. On the Orochimaru front, it seemed like his former teammate had holed up in his little village and was licking his wounds. That was another day wasted. He would get in a few hours of downtime before he wandered off to bed and checked on Naruto's progress again in the morning. That boy truly was his father's child, as well as his mother's. He seemed to be an almost even blend of both of his parents, in fact. He had his mother's bone structure and his father's coloring. He had a personality that was a mix of both that of his father and his mother, and possessed his mother's somewhat charming verbal tick, though he sometimes ended his sentences with tebeo, rather than the tebane his mother had used. Someone had obviously worked with Naruto on that verbal tick since it showed up most often when he wasn't paying attention, or was rather excited. Teaching Naruto was a somewhat enjoyable experience, and he could see why both little Kakashi and Shimura Tetsuo had been reluctant to let him go. The boy learned a great deal with minimal instruction, had incredible leaps of intuition that left you scratching your head as you raced to keep up, learned at an incredibly fast pace, and would still be at it long after another person would have given up and wandered off to do something else. He couldn't wait until he was able to instruct Naruto full-time rather than split his attention between two tasks. He would branch out his search to other nearby towns in the morning. Somebody had to know something about where Tsunade was located. Tsunade didn't really care about the money that flowed away like water. She knew she wouldn't win. She never won. Not in life, or in gambling. The times it did seem that she had won at one or the other were just the universe setting her up for an even greater disaster. She'd learned that long ago. Gambling took her mind off of them. She couldn't think their names. If she did, she would see their faces again, see their faces as they had been both in life and in death. Damn. It was too late. She was remembering them again, but then again, she never forgot. They had hung at the edges of her mind day in and day out for decades. As far as she was concerned, it was a good thing that Shizen had her mother's hair, unlike her and Dan's cousins. Seeing that blue-haired family running about happy and healthy without Dan there had been much too painful. Unlike some of his relatives from his mother's side of the family who had been known to make off with anything that wasn't nailed down, Dan hadn't been all that much of a thief, even though he had stolen her heart. He had then carried it away with him into death the day he had died on that battlefield. Nawaki had been a surprise that had come long after her parents had lost hope and begun to think that Tsunade would be an only child. Her mother had had a hard time conceiving her, and had come to believe that her inability to have any more children had been related to the fact that she had been born after the Kyuubi had been sealed away within her mother. Her parents had married at a rather young age after meeting and falling in love during a rather difficult mission, and she had been born after almost 3 years of miscarriages. When her mother had announced that she was pregnant, the whole family had been cautiously optimistic. The first trimester passed without incident, and they breathed a collective sigh of relief. The second trimester passed, and the child was still there. Then came the third trimester, and Nawaki's extremely early arrival. Everyone had said that it had been a miracle that Nawaki had survived. Nawaki had been the family miracle child who had been loved and doted upon by everyone. As he grew, it had become more and more obvious that the boy was more like his Uzumaki cousins rather than his Senju relatives. He had been adventurous, wild, bold, passionate, and determined. When Nawaki had been placed on a genin team under her former teammate Orochimaru, she had been certain that her teammate would keep her brother safe. Nawaki's death had marked the beginning of the end for the Sannin. Orochimaru had not been able to deal with death and loss all that well, and he had lost a great deal during the Second Shinobi War as well as the Third. It had more than likely been these losses that had driven Orochimaru to hole himself away in his lab studying things, and start forgetting that people were actually people, not test subjects. After one has been given leave to experiment on the enemy however one pleased, it was only a short jump to experimenting on others, such as fellow villagers. She herself had almost made that leap a few times and could understand what had driven Orochimaru to do so. She had heard the reports that Konoha had been invaded and the Sandaime killed, but as she hadn't listened to the original broadcast, she had taken them with a grain of salt. Rumor had Konoha in every state from entirely intact minus some cosmetic damage to completely destroyed with only a few survivors wandering through the rubble. She'd seen a couple Konoha shinobi out on missions, so she knew that the village hadn't been destroyed, as it was apparently still open for business. The shinobi she'd seen looked rather stressed and somewhat overworked however, meaning that the village was short-staffed at the moment. How short-staffed however, she couldn't tell. It wasn't her concern however. She had left Konoha and its problems behind long ago after she had lost everything. She wouldn't let them trail behind her reminding her of her losses wherever she went now. She had more than enough reminders already. Orochimaru hated this. It had nearly been a month since his former sensei had called upon the Shinigami and sealed his arms away. If it had merely been that he couldn't use his arms, he wouldn't be nearly as frustrated as he was. Along with a lack of mobility in his arms though, there was excruciating pain. He didn't like pain, and he didn't like people seeing him when he was weak. It had been for those two reasons that he'd killed any number of Kabuto's assistants who had been assigned to help him. The only reason he was putting up with this was because he was waiting for Sasuke. He would have had the boy kidnapped earlier and brought to him, but the child had been attacked by Itachi and by all accounts was laying in a coma, and therefore useless for his purposes. Itachi was yet another thorn in his side. He didn't want to throw this body away just yet if there was a chance that it could be salvaged. Changing bodies was rather difficult and left him weakened for a time. For probably the first time, he was glad that he'd selected a female body this time as he was still experimenting with the transfer process. If he had been in a male body, going to the bathroom would be far more difficult and rather unpleasant, especially considering what it would take to go to the bathroom without assistance. He knew this, because when he'd gained his ability to extend his tongue incredible distances, he'd done what anyone would have done with such an ability, and experimented. He was able to shut out his sense of taste when he had to, considering the fact that he used his tongue to grab a wide variety of objects, including people, but still, doing that was unhygienic as far as he was concerned. He was in a particularly bad mood today since the pain was worse than normal, and Kabuto's current assistant was an unrepentant ass-kisser that Kabuto probably sent to get out of the way permanently. He wasn't really in the mood to take the medicine he'd been given, however, since it had an awful flavor that he couldn't entirely shut out, a horribly bitter aftertaste that took enough water to leave him feeling bloated to get rid of, and the texture was downright nasty. He had a feeling that Kabuto did this to the medicines he made to prevent malingering, and to keep people from bothering him since they were too afraid to approach him for treatment. After he'd killed Kabuto's assistant, Kabuto finally showed up to check on him and give him the good news. Tsunade had been found. He was going to get his arms fixed. As soon as he got his arms fixed, he could go and get Sasuke fixed. As soon as Sasuke was fixed, he was going to put his curse seal on the boy and prepare him for transfer. Everything was looking up. Kabuto helped him dress, tying all of the fiddly bits that he couldn't deal with using his tongue, and they set out from his lair after Kabuto cleaned up the mess that had once been his assistant, since he didn't want to come back to find it stinking up the place, since his other subordinates were too afraid to enter his room unless ordered, and probably wouldn't do so even if it was to remove a rotting corpse. All too soon, they were on the road, traveling at an excruciatingly slow pace since he didn't want to trip and land flat on his face. He wasn't in the mood to go licking the ground in order to get up. They would reach Tsunade, though. They would reach Tsunade, and he would use his ace in the hole to get his arms fixed. He knew Tsunade's weaknesses, all of them, and he wasn't above using each and every last one to get what he wanted. Jiraiya had been asking around a bar that was the local watering hole for gamblers when he finally struck pay dirt. His long-stalled search for Tsunade had finally grown hot. The legendary sitting duck had lost big time, and headed out of the town he was asking in. Fortunately, one of the other gamblers had heard her intended location. After thanking the man who really shouldn't be drinking in the mid-afternoon, not that he was really one to talk, he raced out to where he'd left Naruto. The boy was in the clearing he'd left him in, destroying trees as he fine-tuned his Rasengan. The boy had almost fully mastered in a single month a jutsu that had taken him more than 3 months to learn. "You truly are your affair, mother's son," he told the boy as he examined the tree that had just been trashed when he'd entered the clearing. "You'll have to finish working on this on the road. I've found a lead on Tsunade, and we have to leave now before she goes on the move and vanishes again." The somewhat tired-looking boy perked up at this, and started looking excited. He could tell that the month of relative inactivity had been wearing on him. Naruto was hyperactive and had a great deal of energy, just like his mother had at that age. It had taken her years to calm down, and even then she hadn't calmed down entirely. He had considered taking Kushina on as a student at one point, as she had reminded him a bit of himself when he was younger, but his sensei had forbidden it. For one, Kushina was the Kyubi Jinchuriki, and he hadn't wanted her out in the open where she would be vulnerable for another abduction attempt like the one Kyumo had made around the time he'd made his request. 2. Kushina was a girl, and he was well known far and wide as a pervert, even then before he'd written his famous Ika Ika novels. Taking her on as a student could seriously damage his reputation even if nothing happened. Considering all of the things that had been said after Orochimaru had run off with Enko, he had to concede that point. Having Naruto as his student was interesting. It was like having Minato and Kushina all rolled into one package. He found himself wondering exactly what the future would bring, as the boy was as stubborn as his father, as unpredictable as his mother, and as talented as both of them had been at that age. Now, however, he would have to concentrate on what he was going to say to persuade Tsunade to return to a village she had sworn to never return to, and to take a job she never wanted. Chapter 37: Tsunade Retrieval, Deals and Refusals. Momochi Zabuza carefully schooled his expression so his darling wife wouldn't see his disgust and misinterpret it. He hated vomit. Looking at it made him want to puke, and that was just what his wife was doing at the moment. As was his husbandly duty in this instance, he was holding the Mizuki's hair back away from the toilet. He just wished that there wasn't so much of it. The woman's hair was extremely thick and nearly ankle length, and bits of it kept trying to escape and head for the toilet. He hoped it was all worth it in the end. One day, he would have an heir to carry on the Momochi family name, but until then, he would have to put up with vomit, odd cravings, and eventually a small creature that screamed for food and attention at all hours, crapped itself, and did God only knew what else. Orochimaru hadn't particularly cared that the castle that had been destroyed by the serpent that Kabuto had summoned for him had been listed as a cultural heritage site, or that it had been more than 500 years old. He'd destroyed things that were far older, things that were far more valuable, and things that were both before in times of war and times that should have been of peace. What Orochimaru cared about was that he was close to his goal, and that the pain and the sickness that had come with his sensei's final curse would finally end. He would have to play this carefully, and not show any more than his most obvious weakness while prodding at Tsunade's major one. A proper entrance was often half the battle, and he just made a majorly impressive one that was sure to put his former teammate slightly off guard. Now to push her completely off center. During the initial negotiations, things went pretty much how he figured they would go. Tsunade was naturally slightly pissed over the death of their sensei, and told him as much. He himself still felt a twinge of something, but it was mostly buried under his hatred of the old man who had taken his arms with him into death. There had naturally been a squabble between his apprentice and Tsunade's. They had appeared to be even in that small bout, but he knew that Kabuto was the stronger of the two, the stronger and wilier of the two. Tsunade tried her best to bluff her way out of the situation with a small show of power, but he knew the woman far too well to fall for it. He made his offer, and then he left. As he had suspected, Tsunade hadn't gotten over her hemophobia, but considering the source of it, it was likely that she never would. He had given Tsunade a week to decide, a week to stew over things. She knew that Tsunade would be spending that week suffering, as she would be able to do nothing other than think of those she lost, those she failed, those she had come to believe she had killed by handing over her grandfather's necklace. Tsunade would either agree to the deal, or she would try to kill him. Knowing Tsunade, he knew that it would be a very close decision for her, even though he planned on turning around and destroying Konoha as soon as his arms were repaired, and the losses amongst his forces compensated for. Tsunade had come to despise the village that she had believed had taken the lives of the ones she loved, the village that her brother and her lover had both sworn to rule over as Hokage one day. He liked both Nawaki and Dan in his own way. Nawaki had been on his first genin team, a team he hadn't been certain that he was ready for but had taken anyways since it was necessary for the war effort. Nawaki was brave, bold, and far too easily excitable for his own good. It had cost the boy his life. Had Nawaki not run ahead of the team that day, and survived, there was a small possibility that he would have been the one running around the village bragging about the fact that his student had become Hokage rather than Jiraiya. That would have been after he'd grown tired of being Hokage himself, of course. Had Dan survived, there was a good chance that he would have been the Yondaime instead of Minato. Both were extremely talented men who had loved their village, but Dan had been slightly more loved by the populace who had some reservations about Minato's powers and abilities up until his death had wiped out every bad thing the citizens of Konoha had felt about him. The position should have been his with either Dan or Minato having even been considered, but that was neither here nor there. In a week's time, he would learn Tsunade's answer, and be able to plan accordingly. While he did hope she would accept, and do anything it took to get Dan and Iwaki back again as she had once said she would as she cried over their graves, he wasn't banking on it. If worst came to worst, he could take more drastic measures to get his former teammate to cooperate. Though Tsunade didn't seem to realize it, there was still someone in her life, someone she would miss. The fact that that little assistant of hers was one of Dan's blood relatives was just icing on the cake as far as he was concerned. It would make the loss all the more traumatizing for his former teammate. Sakura sighed as she replaced the dead flower in the vase by Sasuke's bed with a fresh one again. She wished that there was something she could do for her teammate, but the only thing she could do was what the medics were doing already, sitting, waiting, and hoping that Sasuke would still be Sasuke when he woke up. Though she had begun to research medical jutsu on her own, she didn't have the knowledge necessary to heal her teammate. She had been coming here every day when she wasn't on missions or tending to other duties. One day, Sasuke would wake up, and she'd be there to see it, be there to see for herself whether or not her teammate was alright, or would be in the future. She had visited Kakashi-sensei earlier like she usually did. He was in much the same condition as Sasuke. Guy was there like he always was when he wasn't training or on missions. Lee was there as well like a shadow or a miniature clone. Lee was currently on leave while his leg healed. From what she'd heard, a building or something had fallen on him while he had been protecting Konoha during the invasion. Lee occasionally came to check on Sasuke as well, but mostly it was to see how she was holding up rather than out of sympathy for her teammate's condition. Niji had shown up as well at one point, but that had been to ask where Naruto had gone off to. She couldn't tell him beyond the fact that he'd gone on some sort of mission, and had yet to return despite the fact that it had been a month. Niji had some small burn scars across his arms, and moved with a slight limp as a result of the beating he had gotten when he had gone to rescue his cousin despite having been shocked and burned a short while before. During the invasion, a couple of Kumo ninja had taken the opportunity to kidnap Hinata, who was still recovering from the injuries she'd sustained. Niji and Kiba had gone out to retrieve her since nobody else could be spared at the time. The two of them had nearly died before Hyuga Hayashi and his father were finally able to reach them and rescue all three of them. Ino had visited on several occasions, and instead of fighting as usual, they had sat and talked of old times as they waited for signs that Sasuke was regaining consciousness. Their friendship may never become what it had been before she'd thrown it away over Sasuke, who couldn't have cared less about her at that point, but it was on the mend. It seemed to be the only good thing that had come out of this entire disaster. Jiraiya had gone to every gambling hall in Tanzaku and failed to find Tsunade. At each establishment, he'd half expected to see his former teammate drunkenly throwing money and chips down for the dealer or her fellow gamblers to rake in. No Tsunade, however. There were any number of people who had seen and taken the money of the legendary sitting duck, but no one seemed to know where she was at the moment, even when he'd plunked down money for the information. His most recent lead had been a pachinko parlor where Tsunade had actually won, oddly enough. That could be a very bad sign, however, as whenever Tsunade won at gambling, something terrible always followed. After a while he had decided to find a bit of high ground and search for his teammate with the telescope he usually used for research. Tanzaku had a rather tall and impressive castle that was set above the town, which would serve his purposes nicely. Jiraiya? Naruto asked when he informed the boy of their new destination. Where's the castle? He blinked, and turned, before noticing the massive and rather new-looking pile of rubble where the castle should be. He had known that he was preoccupied over the coming reunion between himself and Tsunade after more than a decade of being apart, and with his argument to persuade her to take an unwanted job off his hands, but to be so unobservant as to not even notice that one of the major local landmarks was missing entirely, as he made his way up the hill to survey the damage. Someone came running down yelling something about a giant snake. Crap. Orochimaru had found her first. He should have known, considering the fact that death and destruction on a massive scale were more Orochimaru's speed. From the lack of further damage in the surrounding area barring what looked like one of Tsunade's infamous wall punches, he was guessing that there hadn't been a battle, or that it hadn't been a long one. Both Orochimaru and Tsunade were long gone from the area, and it was more than likely that Tsunade had fled Tanzaku as well. Now that he had a trail to pick up, it shouldn't take him another month to find her again. He had always been better at finding things than Orochimaru was. Orochimaru could lose his house keys by setting them on his dresser. He would do a sweep of Tanzaku just in case, as it was possible that Tsunade had gone to ground hoping that Orochimaru would think she'd fled and go searching for her elsewhere. Naruto sighed. He was tired, and his feet hurt. He could walk or run for far longer than a day if he really had to, but it still wasn't all that pleasant. Eventually, Jiraiya had called a halt to their search for Tsunade, who had most likely survived her encounter with Orochimaru, as there weren't any bodies or blood in the area surrounding the shattered wall near the ruins of the castle, which were more than likely filled with dead tourists. It was possible that Tsunade had been one of the tourists that had been inside the landmark at the time the castle was destroyed, but Jiraiya said that that was highly unlikely since the wall had appeared to have been her work rather than Orochimaru's. They walked into a pub for dinner. He was half expecting the owner to shoo him out as they did so. It was pretty much only in Konoha and probably the other ninja villages that children didn't get shooed out of the bars. In Konoha, if you had a Hittite, you could pretty much go anywhere that wasn't restricted to authorized personnel only. While genin weren't allowed alcohol, they were allowed to sit with their chunin friends who were, and if the chunin happened to slip their friend a drink, well, it didn't usually get commented on. As luck, or perhaps Jiraiya's chakra sensing abilities when it came to teammates and others who had been close to him would have it, Tsunade happened to be in the bar Jiraiya had selected in the process of getting completely wasted. They moved to sit with her, and Jiraiya ordered a rather nice meal for all of them. He decided to use the meal to get a better understanding of his new Hokage, who had once been one of the old man's students, the same as Jiraiya and Orochimaru. As he studied his new Hokage, he noticed that he could see a bit of Senju Hashirama about her, especially around the nose and the mouth, though she bore a stronger resemblance to her maternal grandmother Uzumaki Mido. She had her father's hair color, however. She seemed supremely unhappy, and he had a feeling that it had something to do with her encounter with Orochimaru, which she hadn't really seemed to want to talk about. Throughout the meal, Jiraiya kept serving Tsunade drinks, even though she didn't need any more, and would quite likely end up with alcohol poisoning if she continued to drink at the rate she had been during the meal and before it if the number of empty bottles in front of her were any indication. Oddly enough, it seemed as if Jiraiya were bracing himself for something as the meal progressed. After a while, when Jiraiya and Tsunade were done eating, Tsunade asked what Jiraiya wanted with her, and he informed her. She did not appear to be pleased with the news. If it had been him, he would have been jumping around in joy, not shuffling a deck of cards for a game with Jiraiya and almost calmly discussing the old man's death, as if she hadn't really cared either way. As Tsunade and Jiraiya sat there almost calmly playing cards, Jiraiya asked her what her answer to the village's request that she become Hokage would be. He knew that people said things they didn't mean when they were drunk, but insulting all 4 of the previous Hokages and the village and saying the mean things she had said about the yondaime and the old man? Had he still been as wild as he had been when he'd first become a genin, he probably would have tried to beat Tsunade up regardless of the consequences. As it was, "This bitch is going to be Hokage?" he asked while she was talking about the job being nothing but trouble. "You want someone like her in charge of the village? The only good I see coming out of that would be the fact that the villagers would all be cheering for some reason other than feeling that they were obligated to do so when I get named Hokage." "You? Hokage? Ha!" Tsunade said as she grabbed her drink. "I swore I'd become Hokage one day, and that's one promise that only death will make me go back on," he said as he clenched his fists under the table. "It would be supremely stupid to attack one of the Sannin, especially the one who had been named Hokage, even though she hadn't earned that title. While she had refused for now, they hadn't spent an entire month searching for the woman only to go home empty-handed, and he knew that Jiraiya wouldn't leave it at that. He couldn't. If he did, that would mean the only other viable option for the position of Hokage besides Tsunade was Jiraiya, and he wasn't sure which of them would be worse. Don't get him wrong, he liked Jiraiya, and the man had been added to his list of precious people, but he wasn't the sort of leader Konoha needed now, or ever for that matter. The man was a drunken pervert who frittered almost all of his available cash away on women and booze and would have taken his money to spend on them as well if he ever gave him the opportunity. Jiraiya was like Satoshi, you had to watch your stuff around him, other than that, he was fine. He just wasn't what Konoha needed, especially considering the state the village was currently in. Tsunade gave him a strange look before spending the rest of the evening quietly drinking until she passed out. Chapter 38, Tsunade Retrieval, Tsunade's Choice. Tsunade had woken up the morning after her meeting with Jiraiya with a massive hangover. She had drank enough to pass out, but she hadn't drank enough to forget yesterday, however. She had the feeling that it would take enough alcohol to kill her to do that. She should have known her day would go to hell like it had when she'd won big time at the pachinko parlor. Orochimaru had given her an offer that she wasn't certain she could refuse yesterday afternoon. If she had a Rio for the number of times she had wished that she could have Dan and Nawaki back, she would be able to pay back all of her debts tenfold. Orochimaru had offered to bring them back to her. All she would have to do would be to heal his arms, which was simple enough. There was a catch to this though. There always was a catch. First of all, if she accepted the offer and healed the arms of her teammate, the man who had betrayed Konoha, the man who had killed their sensei, he would turn around and destroy the village she had left forever along with Dan's niece more than a decade ago. Secondly, in order to get Dan and Nawaki back, she would have to sacrifice the lives of 2 other people. While she was willing to sacrifice a couple of strangers, maybe a couple of criminals who didn't deserve to live, she had a feeling that Dan and Nawaki wouldn't be happy that she had done so in order to bring them back. They would be even more unhappy if they discovered that she had betrayed the village that they had sacrificed their lives for by helping the man who had murdered the Hokage and swore to destroy Konoha. She wanted them back so badly though, and having them gone hurt so much. To top off her day from hell, Jiraiya showed up with Kushina and Minato's brat, and told her that Konoha wanted her to be the Godame Hokage. She never wanted to be Hokage. That had been Nawaki and Dan's dream. That had been the dream that both of them had died for. That had been the position that had taken her grandfather, her great-uncle, her sensei, and Jiraiya's student. She has the feeling that Jiraiya won't leave her alone until she says yes and follows him back to the village that she'd sworn never to return to though, even though she would be the worst Hokage in the history of Konoha. Minato's son who greatly resembled Kushina, and Nawaki who had taken after their Uzumaki relatives, told her as much. Like Minato who had died in office, Kushina who had sacrificed herself to reseal the Kyuubi, Nawaki who had died in the field, and Dan, who had died right in front of her. Little Naruto's dream was to become Hokage. Like little Nawaki, he too had sworn not to go back on his word. Why couldn't Jiraiya have left her alone, left her to her a life where she didn't tally up all of the precious people she had lost instead of just the two most painful losses, left her to a life where she had pretty much forgotten the existence of her young cousin who had reminded her far too much of Nawaki just as her son was now? She strongly suspected that Jiraiya knew exactly how much it hurt to see that boy, and that had been why he had brought him along. Just looking at that boy who looked like Nawaki, but who had Dan's barely restrained temper, was painful. That boy in whom Kushina's fire flashed from Minato's eyes. Making her decision on whether or not she should accept Orochimaru's offer was difficult enough without Jiraiya showing up with a living reminder of the people she lost. Heck, that kid even had her mother's whisker marks that had been the sign of a child who had been born to the Kyuubi Jinchuriki. On the one hand, Nawaki and Dan would be disappointed in her if she betrayed Konoha by helping an enemy. On the other, however, they didn't need to ever know what she had done, especially if she kept them away from Konoha, or rather the crater Orochimaru was going to turn Konoha into forever. She would be glad to have them back, even if they were upset with her. This decision shouldn't be so hard. She knew what right was, and she knew what had been in the oaths she had taken as a genin. She knew what her grandfather, whom she didn't really remember since he died when she was a toddler, would say. She knew what her great-uncle, who had died while she was still small, would say. She knew what her sensei would say. She knew what Jiraiya's little apprentice would say. She knew what Nawaki and Kushina would say loudly and frequently. But still, she did her best to avoid Jiraiya and the boy for the next couple of days. Jiraiya knew something was up beyond her reluctance to become Hokage. He always could read her like an open book. After 2 days, her former teammate caught up with her and told her that he would personally kill her if she betrayed Konoha. She could tell that it killed the man to tell her this. Jiraiya had always loved her, as a friend and as a teammate. Though he still held out the vague hope that they could become something more, he didn't hold it out that far. She, Jiraiya, and Orochimaru had been the closest knit of genin teams for their generation, 3 early academy graduates who had been handpicked to be trained by the Sandaime Hokage himself. The 3 of them had meteorically risen through the ranks, sticking together as they did so. They had been each other's closest friends for decades, even when circumstances and war tried to rip them apart. Konoha had never seen the likes of them again, though there was one other team that had come close, before it had been torn apart by the Third Shinobi War. That team had been Team Minato, which had been trained by the future Yondaime Hokage. There had been the somewhat aloof and extremely talented orphan who had little to no idea as to how to connect with others. There had been the talented and tough medical specialist. And there had been the determined goof who had held the 3 together. She knew that Jiraiya had been considering taking on the little goofball Obito as an apprentice before the boy had died. It was a real pity that had happened. She liked Obito, he'd been so much like Nawaki. When the team had split at the end of the Third Shinobi War, and Orochimaru had fled, it had hurt almost as much as losing Nawaki and Dan had. It had been then that she had taken Shizen and left Konoha, which no longer held anything for her but painful reminders of what had been, and what could have been. She could tell that the split and Orochimaru's betrayal had hurt Jiraiya greatly as well. Jiraiya too had left Konoha upon the death of his student, and had taken to drinking far more heavily than he should, much as she did. Neither of them had been able to bring themselves to kill Orochimaru in the near decade and a half since he had been discovered to be a monster. Even though he was a traitor, he was still a teammate, and neither of them had been willing to get his blood on their hands. Now, however, Jiraiya had told her that if she too betrayed Konoha, she wouldn't survive the betrayal, and he had meant it. Though following through would more than likely kill him, Jiraiya had meant it. All too soon, the week was almost up, and Shizen was demanding that she not go. She did the only thing she could do at that point, and made sure that Shizen didn't follow her the next day. There was a good chance that things would go wrong, and despite what she chose, she didn't want Shizen to get caught in the crossfire. Shizen was all she had now, and she didn't want Dan's niece dying for her as well. Jiraiya hadn't been having a good week. He had come to a decision that he knew would kill him earlier that week after he'd begun to suspect another of his teammates of treason. When he'd first suspected Orochimaru, he hadn't wanted to believe it, and he didn't want to believe it now despite the very obvious signs Tsunade was displaying. Ironic really, the person who had been nominated as Godaime Hokage of Konoha being willing to betray the village the way he had a more than sneaking suspicion that Tsunade was. He'd known that Tsunade would originally reject the position of Hokage, but he had been certain that he would find a way to get her to come around, even if he had to invoke the names of Dan and Nawaki. He knew that Tsunade would see a great deal of Nawaki in Naruto as well as little Minato and Kushina. Kushina and Tsunade had been as thick as thieves at one point. Now, he wasn't too sure. Perhaps it would have been better if he had accepted the position of Hokage and not been forced to face the possibility that Tsunade too could be a traitor to Konoha. Hearing her speak as if she didn't care that their sensei was dead had been painful. Hearing her call the man who had practically raised them a fool for giving his life for the village hurt even worse. Tsunade had met with Orochimaru before he had found her, and something had happened. Something that she wasn't willing to share. Between him and Orochimaru, Tsunade had always been a bit closer to Orochimaru. When they were small, Tsunade had had a massive crush on the other boy, and he wasn't entirely certain that those feelings were gone. Even though Orochimaru was a traitor, he was one of the few people Tsunade had left, one of the few people they both had left. They had, all three of them, been closer than blood. That wasn't exactly something you threw away, even if one of the people closest to you hurt you as badly as Orochimaru had. After a week of getting the runaround from Tsunade, he decided that it would be the best idea to interrogate Shizen while Tsunade was away. Over the past week, he'd been dropping hints that he knew something was going on and that Orochimaru was involved, but Shizen had been silent, remaining loyal to Tsunade. She had looked even more stressed with each passing day, however. He had a feeling that she might finally break down and spill everything today. If not today, then tomorrow maybe. He headed to Tsunade and Shizen's room with Naruto trailing behind. When he got there, it was to find Shizen on the floor unconscious. She was quickly revived, and turned out not to be very seriously injured, however. She had been taken down by a medical technique of some sort. "Oh God! We have to go, we have to stop her!" Shizen said after she was fully awake and had been given the date and time. "What is it we have to stop?" he asked as he followed Shizen out the window. Orochimaru offered to revive Dan and Nawaki if Tsunade fixed his arms for him. He gave her a week to decide, and that week is up now. I hadn't thought she would seriously consider the offer, but she did. I had begged Tsunade not to go, but she went anyway, Shizen said as they raced through the trees towards what was presumably the meeting point. "Oh damn," he said. He had hoped and prayed that it wouldn't come to this. "Who was Dan?" Naruto asked, apparently having known who Nawaki was from his research on Tsunade, which didn't seem to have been completed. He had almost sent the boy away, but they would need all of the help they could get, especially since he had no idea how many people Orochimaru would bring with him. He prayed that the boy wouldn't get killed in the coming battle. Dan was Tsunade's boyfriend. He died early on in the Third Shinobi War. Tsunade was there trying to heal him when it happened, he replied. "Oh," Naruto said as they continued towards the place where Tsunade and Orochimaru would meet. All he could think as they raced towards the coming battle was, "Oh God, not both of them." He'd lost his sensei, and now he'd lost both of his teammates forever. After the invasion, he had finally acknowledged the fact that he would have to kill his former friend the instant the opportunity presented itself. Now, he would have to kill Tsunade as well, since she too had turned traitor to Konoha. The day that the other two Sannin were dead would be the day he too died. The three of them would be together in death, much the way they had once been in life. "I'm sorry, Naruto," he said. "Why?" Naruto asked. "I'll tell you later," he replied. The boy didn't need the knowledge of what he planned to do clouding his concentration during the coming battle. The time she had dreaded all week had come, and Orochimaru was standing in front of her. "Have you made your decision?" Orochimaru asked. "Yes," she replied. "I'm sorry, Dan, Nawaki, I'll be seeing you soon." She gathered her chakra into her hands. Chapter 39, Tsunade Retrieval, No More Sacrifices. Closer. Closer. Tsunade thought as Orochimaru had managed to force his arms to move to reach out for the sphere of chakra she had created. Any second now, the deed would be done, the Sannin would truly be separated forever, and she would see Dan and Nawaki again soon when she followed her teammate into death. She had almost been willing to do a most heinous thing in order to have Dan and Nawaki by her side in life where she knew for a fact that she would be able to see and hold them again. Instead, she would have faith that they would be waiting for her on the other side. She wasn't as good, or as strong a person as Dan and Nawaki had been. She had been weak. Because she had been weak, she had almost been willing to drag Dan and Iwaki back into this world in spite of any feelings they might have had about her doing so. Almost. Suddenly, there was a kunai sailing through the air, and Orochimaru had leapt back away from the sphere of energy that would have been his death, as it shredded him apart from the inside rather than healed him the instant he came into contact with it. She had forgotten about Orochimaru's assistant. So close. So close. I honestly hadn't expected you to betray me like this, Tsunade, Orochimaru said. I really would have brought Dan and Iwaki back. I know, she replied. I was almost weak enough to allow you to do it too, despite any wishes they may have had in that regard. I miss them so much and would have given almost anything to hold them in my arms again, but not this. I will be joining them anyway soon after I deal with you. With that, she attacked, not really caring that Orochimaru and his bastard assistant, who was also a medical nin, if what he'd said was any indication, were leading her into a place that would be more advantageous for them. All that mattered was destroying Orochimaru before he destroyed the home that Dan and Iwaki had sacrificed themselves for. She would be seeing them again soon, and she wanted to say at the very least that she had died protecting their home just as they had. She had almost forgotten what their wishes would have been in her desperation to see them again, just as she had almost forgotten how to be the person that they had loved. If she hadn't gone to say goodbye to Jiraiya, and possibly spike his drink so he wouldn't follow her today, she probably would have made a different choice, but she hoped that she would not have. She hoped that regardless, she would have thought of Dan and Iwaki's wishes in the end, just as Shizen had constantly begged her to. Just once, she wanted to be strong like she used to be, like Dan, Iwaki, Minato, and Kushina had been. Jiraiya and Naruto had been talking about her when she had found him last night. Naruto had had his doubts about his new Hokage, and Jiraiya had defended her, telling Naruto of the good, kind, and strong person who had vanished long ago and left a washed-up old gambler behind. She wanted to be that person again, that person Jiraiya had spoken about in such glowing terms, that person that Dan and Iwaki had loved, if only for a moment. When she met Dan and Iwaki again on the other side, she wanted to be able to tell them that her death had actually meant something, rather than that she died drunk in a ditch somewhere, as a dried-up old hag. Jiraiya heaved a sigh of relief when he saw signs of a battle at the meeting place, rather than Tsunade and a fully healed Orochimaru. It seemed that some deity somewhere was smiling down on him. He wouldn't be losing Tsunade the way he feared he would. Tsunade would not be dying by his hand on this day, or any other day for that matter. Let's go, he said to Shizen and Naruto as he turned to follow the trail of destruction that led to the battlefield on which Tsunade was currently located, fighting their former comrade. Even though it made him slightly sick to do so, he would fight Orochimaru. He would help Tsunade fight Orochimaru, and this time they would kill him. They would kill him together the way they should have done more than a decade ago. If they had killed Orochimaru then Sensei would still be Hokage, and still be waiting for the proper moment to hand Naruto the hat and retiring once more. He would not have had to come here and try to force Tsunade to take a job she had never wanted, because it was a job he knew he couldn't handle, and would run away from at the first opportunity. Tsunade, however, when Tsunade had something she felt obligated to do, she would do it no matter how she really felt about it. At least that was how the Tsunade he knew had been. He raced ahead, hoping that they would get there in time since Orochimaru most assuredly was not alone. Naruto and Shizen trailed behind. He would have much rather have left them behind, but they might be needed. Orochimaru watched as Kabuto battled Tsunade. Sure, she seemed strong and confident now, but he knew exactly how to pull the wind out of her sails and sap her fighting spirit. If all else failed, Kabuto had been instructed to use the easiest technique to do so. Once Kabuto did so, Tsunade would effectively remove herself from the battle for the same reason that she had been pulled out of the field during the Third Shinobi War. For now, he would let her believe that she was bold, brave, and fierce. It would make her defeat, and the final breaking of her spirit that came with it, all the more sweeter when it happened. After she fell to her weakness, and was unable to rise again, he would oh so kindly guide her back to his home, where she would do as he'd asked, like she should have done in the first place. He hadn't wanted to have to break his former teammate, but if that was what it took. Tsunade charged forward once more. She had yet to lay a finger on even a single strand of Orochimaru's hair. Orochimaru's assistant was young and quick. She, on the other hand, was 50 years old, even though she didn't look it, and wasn't anywhere near as fast as she had been when she was that boy's age. Her age and her lifestyle had taken its toll on her. She wasn't nearly as strong or as fast as she used to be. As she was beginning to tire, the boy popped a food pill of some sort, created a pair of chakra scalpels, and kicked the fight up a notch. In one quick move, he'd evaded one of her attacks and used the scalpels to sever a muscle in her arm and another one in her leg. After hampering her in this manner, he used the chakra scalpels to sever a muscle in her chest, severely reducing the amount of air she could take in, and further weakening her. This had caused the boy to become overconfident, and that had been his undoing. She used a rather sneaky attack that involved messing up the signals the brain sent to the limbs when his guard was down. Even if the boy managed to adapt, he wouldn't be as fast as he had been. It still hadn't been enough though. After a while of experimenting with his movements and figuring out how to compensate, he was back on his feet and attacking. Just when she thought that she would fall to his onslaught, Jiraiya, Shizen, and Naruto appeared, giving her a moment to recover. "So that's how it is then, Kabuto?" Naruto asked her opponent, sounding upset and betrayed. "Yes, that's how it is, Naruto. And I just can't wait until I've got you on my exam table when this is over. You and I will have so much fun together. Not if I kill you first," Naruto replied. Before Naruto, who looked so much like Nawaki, could attack the much stronger opponent and get himself killed the way Nawaki had, she attacked again, giving it all she had. When she backed him into a corner, and it looked like she would actually win, he sliced his hand open and flung the blood that came out all over her. "Stop! Stop! Stop! No! Dan, don't leave me! Not now! Oh God! Dan, no!" She barely noticed when she was flung backwards, or when Shizen began tending to her. All she could see was blood. Dan's blood staining and coating her hands that failed to save him. Blood. Nawaki's blood staining the sheet that had covered him. Blood. Blood that turned the ground of every battlefield red. She didn't really pay any attention as both sides sized each other up and exchanged battle banter in hopes of knocking the other off balance without landing a blow. She didn't really pay attention when Orochimaru's assistant summoned a pair of serpents for Orochimaru, and Jiraiya had summoned one of his larger toads and rode into battle against their teammate. She wasn't watching when Shizen moved in to fight Orochimaru's assistant. All she could see was blood. Blood dripping and staining everything. She barely noticed when Shizen was defeated, and Orochimaru's apprentice started in on her. All she saw was blood. Dan's blood. Nawaki's blood. Blood flowing from the injuries that her unconscious assistant had acquired fighting the boy who was assaulting her. The next thing she knew was that Naruto was standing in front of her, blocking Kabuto's blows. "I won't let you hurt the Hokage!" Naruto yelled as a sphere of blue energy formed in his hand, a sphere of blue energy that she had last seen the boy's father using. "Are you really going to stand there and tell me that you'd give your life to protect that?" Orochimaru's assistant said. "Look at her, she's sitting there trembling like a small child. She's unfit to bear the title Sannin, much less Hokage. It doesn't matter what I feel," Naruto said as he attacked Orochimaru's assistant. "I swore an oath to the old man that I would protect my village and my Hokage, and I won't go back on it no matter what." Orochimaru's assistant dodged Naruto's attacked Naruto with a chakra scalpel, and took out one of the boy's leg muscles. Despite the fact that he was partially immobilized and completely outclassed, Naruto continued to fight, continued to protect her, despite the fact that she was obviously completely unworthy of such regard. As she watched the boy fight, all she could see was Nawaki under the sheet, and Dan lying on the ground after being fatally wounded because he had taken an attack that had been meant for her. "I will become Hokage to protect grandfather's village. And that's why I decided to become Hokage, to protect the village. I swore I would become Hokage one day, and that's one promise that only death will make me go back on." Why? Why? Why was it that the people who deserved such sacrifices made on their behalf died instead? Why was it that the unworthy ones like her survived? Naruto managed to capture the other boy's hand and drive a Rasengan into his chest. In the moment that Naruto did this, Orochimaru's assistant drove a chakra scalpel into his chest. The boy stood for a moment before coughing up blood and falling over. No! No! Nobody else should die for her, especially not Minato and little Kushina's son. Even though the boy was fading fast, she poured healing chakra into him, determined not to let this become a repeat of the day Dan died. It seemed useless though, as Naruto's pulse and breathing stopped entirely. No! She wouldn't let him die. Not now. In the moment she thought it was over, she felt a hand brush against her arm. She looked down and found herself staring in amazement. Despite the fact that he should be dead right now, the child was alive. He was breathing. As she rechecked the boy's condition, the battle between Orochimaru and Jiraiya that had been winding down finally came to an end when Orochimaru fled, saying that he would use another method to fix his arms, and swearing to destroy Konoha. The still seriously injured Kabuto, who had taken the full force of Naruto's Rasengan, and somehow still managed to survive, followed. As Orochimaru was weak, and Jiraiya was at full strength, fleeing had been the only outcome that would be even vaguely in Orochimaru's favor, especially after Jiraiya and his summon had destroyed Orochimaru's snakes. The battle was done, Orochimaru had escaped yet again, and it was now time to go home. They would catch Orochimaru again one day, and when they did, they would finally kill him. Even though she wasn't worthy of the title that had belonged to her sensei only a month ago, she would take the job. She would take the job, and do her best to protect the village that Dan and Nawaki had given their lives for. She would make sure that Orochimaru wouldn't destroy their home no matter how much he wanted to. She would protect their home like she should have been from the beginning, rather than throwing her life away in a variety of gambling dens, trying to forget her brother and her boyfriend, and the sacrifices they had made. Chapter 40 Return to Konoha. The journey back to Konoha was relatively uneventful. They had met no other enemies on the road, and made it back to the village in near record time. To Naruto, the Godame Hokage seemed like an almost completely different person from the bitter drunk he'd met a week earlier. She stood tall and proud, and there was no sign of the shaking she had been doing in the fight against Orochimaru. Not until he'd scratched his arm and started bleeding, that was. Based on Tsunade's shudders, the hemophobia had not entirely vanished. If one didn't know about the drinking, the gambling, and the hemophobia, Tsunade was almost a picture of what a Hokage should be. Stern, serious-looking, straight, and proud. She certainly had the proper pedigree for the position, considering the fact that the current Kages were mostly blood relatives of a prior Kage of their respective village. He just hoped that it wouldn't go as badly as he feared it would. Konoha needed a strong Hokage right now, or at the very least the semblance of one, since the village was currently rather vulnerable at the moment. Fortunately, Tsunade's reputation as one of the Sannin preceded her. When he got home, it was to find Konohamaru expressing his grief over his grandfather's death by trying to prevent a couple Chunin from removing his grandfather's belongings from the Hokage's residence and office. When he'd left Konoha, Konohamaru had been trying to hide how upset he'd been about the old man's death. It seemed that he had finally left the denial stage and moved into anger. While the other ninja were reluctant to deal with Konohamaru, Tsunade didn't indulge the boy. It was quite possible that there had been a similar incident in her past when either her grandfather or her great-uncle had died. After Tsunade had had Konohamaru thrown out of the room he'd booby-trapped, and the tower altogether for that matter, he had spent his afternoon trying to comfort the boy. Nothing he did seemed to work. He was beginning to understand how Konohamaru must have felt when he'd been going through his bad days. Konohamaru would come around eventually, however. Shizen was happy to see the home she hadn't been back to in a very long time. Her faith in Tsunade had recently been restored. It had been slowly slipping for a long time until a couple of days ago. For years it had seemed that her teacher hadn't cared for her or her opinion. No matter how many times she had tried to get Tsunade to listen to her, the woman had gone off and done whatever the hell she wanted, come hell or high water. During the incident that had restored her faith in Tsunade, she thought that she wasn't listening to her at all. She thought Tsunade would make the worst mistake ever, and that thousands of innocent people would have to pay for it. It turned out that Tsunade had heard her words and heeded them, even though she hadn't appeared to do so. The entire week between when Orochimaru had made his oh so tempting offer, and the day Tsunade refused it, she had asked Tsunade what Dan and Nawaki would have wanted. Every time she asked, Tsunade either yelled at her to shut up or walked away. Instead of betraying the village that Dan and Nawaki had sacrificed themselves for in order to bring them back as she had feared she would, Tsunade had listened to her, had considered what Dan and Nawaki would have wanted, and had done the right thing. Not only that, she had accepted the position of Hokage in order to protect Konoha as they would have wanted her to do. The Tsunade who had come back to Konoha was a person she could get behind, a person she would loyally serve for as long as she lived, a person it was an honor to assist rather than an obligation. She would do her part to help Tsunade be the best Hokage that it was possible for her to be. That was the future, however. For now, though, she would wander the village, reacquainting herself with the home that had been fading in her memory over the many years she had been away. Tsunade shivered as she walked through the corridors of the hospital. Though she couldn't see it, she could smell it. There was blood here. It was all over, though it was well hidden. She couldn't let it paralyze her, though. She had come here for a purpose. As she had been getting herself acquainted with her new office and coming duties, Mato Guy had shown up and begged her on bended knee to go and help Kakashi. The man had fallen victim to a genjutsu that had been cast by Uchiha Itachi, and had been in a coma for nearly a month. Genjutsu damage was hellishly tricky to repair as there was very little physical damage involved, but she and Uchiha Kagami had been working on methods for dealing with it before he died. One of their experiments on a prisoner from IWA who had fallen into his own little world after falling victim to an exceedingly traumatic genjutsu that had turned his worst fears against him before he'd been captured on the field of battle had shown a great deal of promise. She wasn't certain if it was a full cure though, as the man had been exchanged for a couple Konoha ninja before she could do any long-term studies. It would be the method she and Kagami had devised that she would use in hopes of waking Kakashi up. Since there didn't seem to be anything else the medics could do, this could be Kakashi's only hope. Hopefully, it wouldn't turn out to be a fool's hope. If Kakashi managed to awaken, he would have to undergo a great deal of therapy in order to recover from whatever had happened in the genjutsu world in which he'd been placed. There were no guarantees that Kakashi would undergo the therapy though. Ninja tended to be rather averse to such things, and trying to force them made them all the more determined to escape. Fortunately for her nerves, Kakashi wasn't bleeding, nor was there a sign that he'd been bleeding recently. There was no blood. There would be no blood during the procedure. She could do this. The method that she and Kagami had developed had been to counter the genjutsu with another genjutsu. She would plant a guide that would lead Kakashi out of whatever hell he was trapped in, and back into the real world. Before doing that, however, she healed the physical damage to his brain that had been caused by the attack and the month-long coma that had followed. Once the small amount of damage was corrected, she sent out her guide, which she was certain that Kakashi would latch onto, as there was no reason for the man to be there in whatever world Itachi had constructed for him. If that guide didn't work for whatever reason, she would send another. The guide she sent was a basic mental image of a person who was important to the victim. It would have the sole purpose of leading the person out of whatever corner of their mind they had retreated to, and back into the real world. While the initial image was basic, just that of a person that the medic selected, such as a father, mother, teacher, or teammate, it would be complete when it reached the genjutsu victim, as they would be filling in any necessary details themselves. Once she put the genjutsu into place, she sat back to wait. Before long, Hatake Kakashi's eyes fluttered open. Based on the way his eyes were scanning the room, he was awake, alert, and aware of his surroundings. Good. She would have to keep him here for several days of observation though. As she prepared to leave, a medic came up to her, and informed her that Kakashi's student Uchiha Sasuke was in much the same condition. She went to the boys' room to find Naruto and a pink-haired girl he introduced to her as his teammate Haruno Sakura there discussing something. From the looks of things, Sakura had visited the room fairly often. "What are you going to do?" the Haruno girl asked when she had mentioned that she was going to help Sasuke. She explained the procedure to the two children. Both seemed to be able to follow her. "Who are you going to send?" Naruto asked. "I was thinking of sending in one of his teammates, since sending in a parent might be traumatic," she admitted. That might not be a good idea," Naruto replied. "Why not?" she asked. "Well, with the state Sasuke's in, either one of us could drive him away. I don't really get along with him, and the feeling's mutual on his part. No offense meant to Sakura, but though she's improved over the last few months, she's a rabid Sasuke fangirl, and he really doesn't like those. Would it be possible for him to choose his own guide?" Naruto replied. "That might be possible," she conceded. The world of darkness that he'd been in for either a moment, or an eternity, or both began to recede. When he looked down at his hands, he found that he was the same size he had been during the massacre. Oh God! Not again, he thought. Instead of turning into that horrible blood-red world where his clan fell around him, he found himself standing on the lakeside dock where his father had taught him how to use the Gokyaku Jutsu. As he studied his surroundings, he could see the final wisps of flame from the jutsu he'd done that day dying over the water. Suddenly, his father was standing there just as he had that day. He remembered this day, the day his father had asked him not to follow in his brother's footsteps. He hadn't understood why at the time, because he dearly loved and admired that man. Now he did. Had his father known what that man was back then? Had he seen the signs of what was to come? Sasuke, his father said. It's time to go home. Home? Had Itachi actually killed him when he used its Tsukuyomi on him again? Had he died without realizing it? He followed his father, wondering if he died without avenging the clan and whether or not his father would be disappointed in him for failing to do so. Instead of following the familiar path to the home his family had once shared, his father had walked out of the Uchiha district and into the village. This isn't the way home, he said, as he turned back onto the path towards their house. Yes, it is, his father said, continuing down the road through the village. He didn't follow, however. He made his way back to the house their family shared, both hoping and dreading what he might find there. His mother stood outside the house sweeping the porch. Sasuke, you're not supposed to be here, his mother said. You're supposed to be going home. But this is home, Ka-san, he replied. No, it isn't, sweetheart, his mother said sadly. After Itachi used its Tsukuyomi on you, you withdrew in on yourself. I'm here to guide you back to the real world where you belong. Why can't I stay here with you? He asked, reluctant to leave this place where his parents and clan were alive. Had he remained in that dark place, he would have been more than happy to leave. Here, however. Who's going to restore the clan if you stay here? His mother asked. That was one of your two main goals in life, wasn't it? You can't restore the clan if you're hiding here. Technically you could, but an outsider would be raising your children, and an outsider would be saying what a Uchiha is and isn't. He felt torn. What his mother said was true, though. If he stayed here, he wouldn't be able to restore his clan, or avenge it. Let's get you home, his mother said, setting the broom beside the house. He reluctantly followed her into the village. As he did so, he found himself wondering why the representation of his inner self was Konoha. It's what you're most familiar with, his mother said, replying to his unasked question. The path home could be anything. For you, Konoha is home, so the path home is Konoha. If that was the case, then either the academy or the library would represent learning and knowledge. Perhaps he could find an answer to the question he'd been asking himself while that man tortured him in one of those two places. Perhaps he would find an answer that he'd forgotten or overlooked while he was doing exactly what that man had told him to do in his pursuit of vengeance. Apologizing to his mother, he turned off the path home and ran for the library. When he reached the library, he found it to be somewhat disorganized for some strange reason. Not only that, but several books had locks on them. One lock appeared to have been broken, and when he flipped through the book with the broken lock, he found that it was his memory of the night of the massacre, the memory of the first time his Sharingan had activated, the memory of that man crying as he fled into the night. He grabbed another of the books. This one was still locked. He tried to pry the lock open, but it wouldn't budge. Damn it, Sasuke. I told you to stay out of here. Sure, Sway, deal with this. I wouldn't keep trying to open that if I were you, said a voice he vaguely recognized. It was an elderly librarian who had been killed during the massacre. You won't like what you find. But, he said. He found that he had a burning desire to know what the book contained. Some things are best forgotten, the librarian said as she snatched the book from him and set it on the shelf. This was one of them. You'd best be getting home now, boy. He turned from the library and rather than heading back to the path where he'd left his mother, he ran to the academy. If the library contained memories of the past, then the academy would contain knowledge. Knowledge was always useful. When he reached the academy, he found it virtually empty. There was nobody there, no teachers, no students, nobody except Uzumaki. Naruto was prying open the teachers' storage lockers in the faculty lounge. He was dressed in the eye-searing shade of orange that he used to wear back at the academy, back when he was the idiot and the class clown. He'd caught Naruto doing this before. As he watched, the boy opened one of the teacher's lunch boxes, one of the teacher's sealed lunch boxes, and dropped several worms and a grasshopper inside. When he finished his prank, he turned around and seemed to notice him for the first time. What are you doing here, Sasuke? You should be going home, Naruto said. I had thought that I would find a way to become stronger than that man here, he replied, feeling kinda stupid. Why do you want to become stronger then? That man? Naruto asked as he led him down a hall that oddly enough didn't lead outside. In order to defeat him and avenge my clan, he replied promptly. Why do you have to be stronger than him to do so? Naruto asked. Because that's how you defeat someone. You become stronger than them, and then you take them down. he replied. Let me ask you something, Naruto said. In our straight taijutsu only spars, what happens? I win sometimes, and you win sometimes, he replied. In our spars where we aren't limited to taijutsu, what happens? Naruto asked. You win all the time because you cheat, he replied. Since you've acquired the Sharingan, has that changed? Naruto asked. No, he replied reluctantly, remembering the number of ways Naruto had devised for getting around his eyes. Well, there you go, Naruto said as he set up the simple prank that he had gotten Yumino-sensei on his first day as their instructor, the prank that had fooled a fully qualified Chunin who had been much smarter and stronger than Naruto had been at the time. A chalkboard eraser, and a bit of vegetable oil, and an academy student took down a full-fledged Chunin. He had his answer. He could defeat that man without becoming that man. He would have to be trickier rather than stronger. He didn't need to get that man's eyes. He needed to find a way around his eyes. You'd better get going. I think your mother's waiting for you, Naruto said as he carefully rigged the clock with a bit of ninja wire in order to move the hands and change the time as he pleased. He returned to the path. His mother had indeed waited. He told her how much he loved her as he went inside the hospital where his mother had led him. His eyes opened, and he found himself staring at a rather sterile-looking ceiling. He was in a bed. Sakura and Naruto were standing nearby, as was a strange blonde woman he didn't recognize. Chapter 41, A Hokage's Task. Orochimaru-sama? Kabuto said as he approached his master who was preparing to transfer to a new body as it would probably take a while to get a hold of Sasuke since he was currently heavily guarded at the hospital. Normally kidnapping the boy and bringing him here wouldn't have been too much of a problem for him, but the new Hokage had changed the entire hospital security system in the wake of his desertion, and he didn't have the new schematics or patrol routes yet. Yes? Orochimaru replied. He was looking rather tired at the moment, and he fully understood. The man was sick and in a great deal of pain. The destruction of Konoha might have to be postponed for a while, he said, deciding to get the worst out of the way, and hoping that Orochimaru didn't kill him due to his current mood. Orochimaru generally wasn't the sort of despot who killed his subordinates at the drop of a hat, at least not deliberately, but the last month or so had been exceedingly trying for him. Why? Orochimaru asked. Oto is currently down by more than 2/3 of our forces, since we poured almost everyone who currently wasn't part of a study into the invasion. I put some feelers out, and after what happened to the Kazekage, none of the other villages are willing to work with us. The Akatsuki turned the job down as well, he replied. How long? Orochimaru asked. 2 years, maybe 3. 4 at the outside. We need to rebuild our forces, and come up with a new plan. The old plan took over a year to create, and is no longer viable, he replied. We will of course be needing updated maps after Konoha finishes rebuilding, since I am almost certain that several streets will be changed now that the opportunity has presented itself since that serpent of yours trashed one of the historical districts. Fine. Whatever, Orochimaru said. Fine? Whatever? Was Orochimaru well? Normally he'd be hopping mad and yelling about such a delay. Did he add to his painkillers without telling anyone again? Was there anything else you wanted? Orochimaru asked, giving him a slightly glassy-eyed look. Crap. He did. And from the looks of it, it was a rather powerful one. He would be having words with anyone who let Orochimaru near the chemistry sets. The lab assistants were supposed to be supervising him while he conducted his experiments to prevent such things. Having patients who could and would make their own medication was, to quote that lazy genin from the last exam, troublesome. Tsunade had thought the inauguration went well. Pretty much all she had to do was stand out on the balcony dressed in her Hokage robes and greet the cheering crowd after her sensei's old teammates had presented her to the general public. After that came the meeting with the clan heads. She could remember when most of them were snot-nosed brats. Hyuga Hayashi was about a decade younger than her, as were Kimichi Chuza and the rest of the original Ino Shikacho team. Inazuka-tsum was about a decade and a half younger than her. It made her feel old. She hated feeling old. That's one of the reasons that she had kept herself looking young. After the meeting, there had been a rather nice dinner which had been provided by one of the civilian clans that owned a number of restaurants and grocery stores. Yesterday and the inauguration that had come with it had been for partying. Today was for work. There was more than enough of it waiting for her when she arrived at her office that morning. Almost the entire desk had been covered in books and papers that were a result of a month and a half's backlog, which included the extra work all of the rebuilding was creating. As she was filling out paperwork on requested renovations for the Ninja Academy, one of her sensei's old teammates, who she had kept on as the woman had been in her sensei's council of advisors for almost as long as she was alive, poked her head in the door. "Hokage-sama?" Koharu said. "Yes?" she asked. "If you have time, I would like you to go over the Chunin exams," Koharu said. "As the Hokage is the one who decides on promotions, and Hiruzen died before any decisions were made. We weren't even sure if we should have any promotions at all this cycle, considering how the exams ended, but Danzo said that the exams were almost over, everyone was able to show off their abilities at least once, and that we should salvage at least something from the entire fiasco." She sighed as she set the paperwork she was dealing with down. "Do you have the footage from the arena?" she asked. "Yes, we do," Koharu replied. "Have it brought to me, and I will review it as well as any suggestions that were made," she replied. 15 minutes later, a VCR, and a tape with the footage from the arena was brought in by one of the numerous office Chunin, along with crowd polls and her sensei's notes, which had been recovered after the invasion. The arena in which the final phase of the Chunin exams took place was one of the only actual parts of the village that was viewable on film to the general public outside of Konoha. All films and shows set in Konoha, outside of the Chunin exams, were actually filmed in a back lot near the Fire Country capital. She bit back tears as her sensei opened the third phase of the exams, oblivious to the fact that his murderer was standing right next to him plotting his demise. She would have to view this as objectively as she could, and she couldn't let the knowledge of what happened a few hours later cloud her judgment. It wasn't necessarily those who had the most impressive fights that earned promotions. If that had been the case, her entire team wouldn't have passed on their first try. It was those who displayed strategic thinking, forward planning, and several other skills necessary for leadership that were promoted. The first fight was Uzumaki Naruto vs Hyuga Niji, and it was almost painful to watch. With the Uchiha gone, the Hyuga were the top contenders for the title of Konoha's most powerful clan. By all accounts, Hyuga Niji, who had been Rookie of the Year for his graduating class, had been the best the Hyuga clan had produced in generations. That didn't show here, however. The arrogant boy with the supposedly all-seeing eyes who had aired his clan's dirty laundry for the entire continent to see never once noticed that he was being led along by the nose until he'd been snapped into a particularly nasty but non-lethal trap. During that fight, Naruto showed excellent strategic skills and good situational awareness as well as good risk assessment. Rather than charging at his opponent who would have shut him down with the Jukin, he had sent in several clones to deal with the boy while he prepared a number of useful traps. Not only that, but he had picked out one of the Hyuga clan's more powerful techniques until he'd found a weakness. Not the best place to do so, but much better a comrade here than a sufficiently imaginative enemy on the battlefield. The second fight had been Rock Lee vs Kankuro of Suna. The fight would be amazing if you were a civilian or a competitive ninjutsu enthusiast. On the battlefield, however, Rock Lee was damn lucky to be alive. The boy was talented. Exceedingly so. To have gotten as far as he had on taijutsu alone was simply phenomenal. It had been the bonus score the boy had gotten on the taijutsu portion of the academy graduation exam that had allowed him to graduate despite getting a 0 on the ninjutsu portion. Bonus scores in the taijutsu section of that exam were rare and almost impossible to get. The boy needed a little polish, though. Going straight into a fight without forward planning or any apparent strategy was a good way to get you and your team killed. Such fights happen sometimes despite a ninja's best efforts, but it was always a good idea to have a basic idea of what you are going to be doing before doing it. Kankuro of Suna's skills with his puppets were well and good, but he too was still a little too rash. It wasn't her job to decide whether or not someone from Suna deserved a promotion, however, that was the Kazakage's job. The fight between Aburaim Shino and Naro Shikamura had been rather short, but she was reasonably certain that she'd seen enough. The Aburaim Kikachu Swarm was a near-perfect counter to the Nara Cage main technique. Neither boy went straight into battle. Instead, both boys took the time to size each other up and work out their strategies. That was if the Nara boy hadn't had his planned out to the last millisecond a month in advance. The fight, when it happened, was lightning quick and was over in a matter of moments. The Nara boy trapped the Aburaim boy in his cage main jutsu at almost the same time that the Aburaim boy trapped the Nara in his swarm of Kikachu. The Nara could have taken a kill shot that would have resulted in a double knockout but had quit instead, knowing such an action would have been a somewhat pointless gesture on his part, as both he and his opponent would have been unnecessarily injured. Beyond the incredibly quick fight, both the Nara and the Aburame boys' records spoke for themselves. The Aburame was one of the most talented in his generation amongst the Aburame, and well ranked when compared to the rest of his generation in Konoha as a whole. The Nara boy was lazy, but had a mind that was either on par with or possibly even surpassed that of his father. The fight between Hirano Sakura and Temari of Suna was interesting to say the least. Sakura showed signs of forward planning, as she had gotten in close range with someone who was by accounts a long-range fighter. Both that and the genjutsu she'd used showed signs of intelligence. The only problem was that the girl didn't know when to quit. The girl didn't know when it was best to give ground, back away, and regroup. Her taijutsu skills did show a great deal of promise though. The fact that she was willing to work in several dirty tricks was rather interesting. She was a girl to watch in the future. As with Kankuro, it wasn't her job to determine whether or not Temari was worthy of promotion. The fifth fight had been Uchiha Sasuke vs. Gaara of Suna. Sasuke seemed to be more of a leap before you look type person, much like Rock Lee. In fact, the boy's taijutsu style during the fight seemed to be a near copy of Lee's. Sasuke was fast, agile, put on an impressive show, but didn't show much in the way of caution. Then again, his teacher wasn't the sort to lead by example in that area. As the old saying went, you become a genin again when you become a jounin. Jounin were allowed to throw many of the rules they had picked up on their way to becoming chunin out the window along with the dress code, as by the time they reached that stage they were strong enough to survive just about anything except say another jounin, or a determined band of chunin. Kakashi was one of the jounin who had done so. The points Sasuke earned in her book for the small amount of caution he'd shown initially were lost again when the boy had run off after his opponent and team during the start of the invasion. Gaara, like his siblings, was not her problem. After the last of the fights was over, she turned to the crowd polls, the notes from various dignitaries, and the notes her sensei had made. All three of them pretty much confirmed her decision. She took her decision to her council of advisors, and they pretty much agreed with her assessment. There had been some minor quibbling on one of her choices, but fortunately her sensei's notes had backed her up. If her sensei had believed him to be ready, who were they to say otherwise, especially when she agreed? Getting out the forms, she wrote up 3 promotions, sent in the requests for 3 Chunin vests adult size small, and 3 uniform vouchers. Once this was done, she sent for Aburame Shino, Nara Shikamaru, and Uzumaki Naruto. Chapter 42, Chunin. Shino stood outside the Hokage's office wondering why he had been chosen for promotion alongside Shikamaru and the Uzumaki. The Uzumaki had more experience as a genin than he and Shikamaru put together, and had even taken on and defeated an A-ranked missing nin. Shikamaru was an absolute genius when it came to tactics, and would have been Rookie of the Year instead of Uchiha Sasuke if he hadn't found the academy graduation exam troublesome, and only done the minimum required to pass. He was rather inexperienced, and somewhat hot-headed for an Aburame. During the invasion, he had gone into a fight not just for the defense of Konoha, but also because he'd been robbed of his chance to deal with his chosen opponent in the arena during the 3rd phase of the Chunin exams. The Suna puppeteer Kankuro had angered him, and insulted 2 of his teammates during the month-long hiatus between the 2nd and 3rd phases of the Chunin exams. He had planned on getting his revenge for this during the quarterfinals, as he'd honestly believed that Rock Lee would lose to the boy. That was not to be, however. When the invasion started, he had taken his opportunity to go after the other boy and get his revenge. His doing so may have worked out to the advantage of those who were hoping to assist Uchiha Sasuke in his fight against Gaara, but still, his motives in that fight hadn't been as untainted as they should have been. Konoha should have come first in his mind on that day. Revenge should have come last or not at all. While he felt honored that he was thought to be ready to attain this particular milestone in his life as a shinobi, he knew in his heart that he wasn't, not quite yet. Shikamaru sighed as he stood outside the door to the Hokage's office, waiting for the new Godane to call him in. He had the sneaking suspicion that he'd only been promoted because the people who helped the Hokage make these decisions thought that he wouldn't sign up to take the Chunin exams a second time. Considering how they had gone this time though, he studied the other 2 who were to be promoted alongside him as he waited. Uzumaki Naruto seemed more than ready for this promotion, which many of the older shinobi believed had been too long in coming. Most of the wild nature the boy had possessed in the academy had been tamed and channeled into more productive areas. The love of pranks had been turned into a trapping specialty, and the unpredictability he possessed had been carefully pruned and cultivated. The rambunctiousness and argumentativeness that had been ever present back during his academy days still showed on occasion, as his mouthing off to Ibiki of all people proved, but for the most part it had been curbed. The academy had done the Uzumaki no favors. The changes that had come about since the Uzumaki boy's graduation had been due to the patient work of someone who had the time to work with the boy one-on-one far more often than Yumino-sensei had been able to with the class he also had to manage, as well as more than 2.5 years of hands-on experience in the field. The Uzumaki boy was a hands-on learner who did better with individual instruction. If Uzumaki had graduated with a year rather than just barely scraping an early pass by the skin of his teeth, there was a strong possibility that all that would have changed about the Uzumaki Naruto he'd known in the academy would have been his age. It was entirely possible that the boy would have failed to graduate the academy altogether if he'd stayed on, as the boy did not flourish in a classroom situation, especially a classroom situation in which he was unpopular and almost universally disliked by his instructors. Yumino-sensei, who genuinely cared about the Uzumaki, would have been able to mitigate some of the damage, but not enough. The man had both arrived too late, and hadn't been able to give the Uzumaki what he needed because he had to divide his attention amongst 26 other students as well. Abirame Shino would make a somewhat average chunin at this point. He was at a level most shinobi were at when they started out as chunin, though he was a little bit younger than many of them, as on average, promotion to chunin generally happened during one's mid to late teens. There were outliers on either end of the scale, but the Abirame wasn't really one of them. While he was one of the best his clan had produced this generation, he wasn't one of those rare geniuses that meteorically shot through the ranks like Hatake Kakashi, for instance, but he had the potential to become a top-ranked jounin later on as he honed his skills. Based on the micro-expressions that were currently crossing what he could see of his face, the Abirame boy did not believe himself ready for this promotion. He honestly wasn't certain about his promotion either. Being a chunin and handling all of the new responsibilities that came with the position was going to be troublesome. Naruto's heart felt like it was trying to escape from its chest when the doors to the Hokage's office opened. The day he had been waiting for, the day he'd been longing for, the day he'd almost been pining for since Satoshi and Suzume had come home in brand new vests a year ago, had finally arrived. He could hardly believe it. He'd finally been promoted. He was going to be a chunin. After a time that seemed both an instant and an eternity, he was standing between Shikamaru and Abirame Shino, whom he hadn't known all that well, in a line in front of the Hokage's desk and being presented with his own vest. "I do not believe that I am ready for this," the Abirame boy said when his vest was presented to him. "The shinobi who watched you during the exams believed you to be ready. Your former instructors believed you to be ready. The council believed you to be ready, and most importantly, I believe you to be ready. In fact, the only person there were any questions over promoting this cycle was Nara Shikamaru," the Hokage replied as she firmly pressed the vest into the boy's hands. The Abirame boy accepted his vest with a bow, while Shikamaru tried to hide his slightly chagrined expression. All too soon, the short ceremony was over, and he was headed down to supply to cash in his uniform voucher. The uniform that the quartermaster handed him smelled slightly musty, but that was probably because there hadn't been a male chunin his size in years. While he was going to be 13 soon, he was still roughly the size of a 10-year-old, which was the youngest age an academy student could graduate at since certain laws had been passed more than 4 years ago. He raced into the nearest restroom to put his new uniform on, since it only smelled like it had been kept in a corner that didn't have adequate climate control for a while, which was something he could handle for the rest of the day since he was feeling too impatient to wait for it to be washed and dried, which would take forever, and threw his vest on over it. Once he was done dressing, he checked himself in the mirror. Even though the vest was a little large, he looked good. After a second glance in the mirror, he stashed his old clothes in a storage scroll he'd had on him, slipped the scroll into one of his new vest scroll pockets, and raced out the door and across the village. The looks he received as he raced through the village were the tiniest bit different this time. Some people didn't even seem to recognize him for a second or two. A couple people looked as if they'd seen a ghost as he passed by them as well. Behind him, whispers of, "He's a chunin?" and "It's about time," trailed in his wake. Before he knew it, he was at the home of the first of his precious people that he wanted to tell about his new rank. Tetsuo had just put his daughter down for a nap when someone started pounding on the door so hard that he was almost afraid that they would knock it off its hinges. It was rattling violently in its frame with each knock as it was. When he flung the door open to give the person on the other side a piece of his mind, he found Naruto on his doorstep. It took him a full second to process what the boy was wearing, and when he did, he found himself saying something completely different from what he had been planning on saying only seconds earlier. "Congratulations, Naruto," he said as he pulled the boy, who smelled faintly of mildew for some reason that he probably didn't want to know the answer to, into a hug. "I knew you could do it. Let's go find Suzume and Satoshi and celebrate." He turned back into the house, told his wife where he was going, and grabbed his wallet. An hour later, he and Naruto were seated at the bar he'd taken his team to when they had celebrated Satoshi's and Suzume's promotions. With them was Satoshi, Suzume, Kurosaki, who had been with Satoshi when they found him, the Haruno girl who had been with Suzume when they found her, the academy instructor Yumino Irika whom they'd run into on the way, Jiraiya who'd most likely heard about Naruto's promotion from the Hokage, Kakashi who'd come in with Jiraiya, and the honored grandson Konohamaru who had managed to sneak in somehow and was being supervised by the academy instructor to make sure he didn't sneak any alcoholic drinks. To Naruto! They, and several other shinobi who had decided to join in on the celebrations, cried as they raised their glasses. At another table, there was a responding to Shikamaru from the former and current Ino Shikacho teams and the friends they had with them. They raised their glasses to that as well. Naruto felt slightly buzzed even hours after the drinking stopped, and they had finally all gone home from celebrating his and Shikamaru's promotions. He assumed that the Aburaim had held a private celebration elsewhere. His nine-tailed occupant wouldn't let him get poisoned, but he also wouldn't do anything about alcohol unless it reached toxic levels, or the resulting hangover, as he had discovered as he once gotten himself drunk to see what it was like, and exactly how impaired he would be in that state. The party had been excellent. In the beginning, there had been two separate groups, one to celebrate with him and the other to celebrate with Shikamaru, but they had eventually merged together as time passed, and he and Shikamaru had eventually found themselves seated side by side as his and Shikamaru's friends toasted the both of them. Eventually, they had been forced to leave when they had run out of the cash they had on hand and the bartender had refused to take a check. He found one reason to be glad he didn't have living parents at the end of the party when he watched as Shikamaru had been forced to drag his heavily intoxicated father home because the man's friends were too drunk to support him themselves. He was about ready to go to bed, but he had a chore to finish first in the laundry room. After pulling his laundry out of the dryer and folding it, he placed his new uniform at the top of the pile. He'd have to get a couple more for use while on duty, which he would have to pay for out of pocket, but he thought that this one would always be his favorite despite the fact that it looked to have had a previous owner who didn't seem to have used it that much, and some practical joker had sewn Uchiha Itachi's name into the collar. After putting his clothes away, he pulled on his nice warm pajamas that were fresh from the dryer and crawled into bed. There was work to be done tomorrow, and there would undoubtedly be pain and suffering down the road as he took on more difficult missions, but today had been absolutely perfect. Chapter 43: Dissolution. Kakashi sighed as he signed the papers before handing them over to the office nin to be properly filed. His team was gone, and while part of him said good riddance, another part was already starting to miss them. Naruto had been promoted to Chunin less than a week before, and as Jiraiya had claimed to him due to an apprenticeship contract that Naruto was stunned to have learned had come into existence the instant he'd signed the Toad's summoning scroll, he had been unable to keep him. There was no way in hell he was going to take one of the brats from the upcoming autumn cycle to fill the space where Naruto should have been, even if there had been one to spare. With that in mind, he had decided to divest himself of the team that had pretty much fallen apart before it could even form. He had done his best to make amends with Naruto. Whether or not their relationship could return to the friendly state it had been in before he'd forced the child onto his team was yet to be seen. The boy could hold a grudge better than Kushina-san, and he had done much to earn Minato-sensei's son's ill will. He had hope, though. After he'd given what for him was an abject apology, though few would recognize it as such, Naruto had told him that he was still one of his precious people. Sakura seemed to be happy about how things were turning out, as she had been wanting a transfer to the medical corps since Wave, as she had informed him when he told her he wasn't going to be her sensei any longer. Sasuke wasn't too happy about the way things were, and he kinda understood. The kid kept losing everyone who came into his life, and now he had lost the team he hadn't wanted to be on in the first place as well almost the instant he had gotten used to his situation. Well, that had been a bust, he muttered as he left the Hokage Tower the instant his business was concluded. and people wondered why he constantly refused to take any genin teams. Sakura's heart sped up as she entered the hospital with her paperwork in hand. Today, she would be starting her formal training as a medic. One of the biggest reasons for her excitement was that Tsunade-sama herself would be teaching some of the classes, and her apprentice Shizen would be teaching others. If she could catch the eye of one or both of them, it was possible that one of them would take her on as their personal student. There were several people who were going to be in the classes with her who were just as good as her in every area if not better, and they too would be vying for such a position. If she was to even have the slightest chance of reaching her goal, she would have to do better than her best, and more than excel. She could do this. She had to do this. There were people who believed in her, and she could not let them down. Naruto grumbled as he followed Jiraiya out of the gates. That whole apprenticeship thing had been a nasty trick to pull, but considering what he'd been doing at the time, he'd gotten what he deserved. Turnabout was fair play, as they say. Sometimes you con them, and sometimes they conned you. Spending an indeterminate amount of time in Jiraiya's company wasn't his idea of fun, but Jiraiya assured him that this particular training trip was vitally important since he would be introducing him to a number of his contacts in his intelligence network. Despite all of his faults, Jiraiya was Konoha's top intelligence agent, and apparently he would be passing the reins on to him even though he wasn't sure he wanted them. The skills he would need to learn to manage an intelligence network would be necessary for when he became Hokage though, so learn he would. Jiraiya assured him that they wouldn't be gone too long, and he would hold him to that promise. Sasuke scowled. He was Uchiha, he was an elite, he wasn't someone to be cast aside and then used to fill a gap. That's what had happened to him, however. Apparently, he and Sakura had been used to fill gaps on a team that consisted of Naruto when Team 7 was formed. As soon as Naruto had gotten promoted, Kakashi had gotten rid of them, and he'd been used to fill another gap. This time, it was on Team 8. He had been sent here to take the Aburame's place since he too had gotten promoted, while he, the Uchiha who should have been promoted instead, had yet again been left in the dust. He knew why he'd been placed on Team 8 rather than handed over to one of the numerous jounin who had been clamoring to take him on as apprentice. Kakashi seemed to think that he needed to be around kids, his own age, and Kurenai was Konoha's top genjutsu expert. He'd rather be on his own with one of the other jounin. That was not to be, however, since orders were orders, and if he tried getting around those orders by leaving the village, which was pretty much the only way he could do so right now, as Kakashi had assured him that if he tried to skip out on any team meetings or training sessions he would personally hunt him down and drag him to Kurenai, both Konoha and those assholes who tried to kidnap him recently would be hunting him down. Why those morons who tried to kidnap him had thought he'd accept Orochimaru's offer, he did not know. The promise of power had been rather tempting for a few seconds until he'd remembered that it was the clever ninja who tended to live longer and win more fights in the long run, and that nobody offers something like that for free. With someone like Orochimaru, there would be some conditions attached to the offer that he didn't even want to think about, and there most assuredly would be a very large price to pay for services rendered in the end. He was stuck on Team 8 until he persuaded the Hokage to give him a transfer. Considering how difficult it was to get an appointment with the woman, he could be stuck waiting a very long time. First try Shippuden. Chapter 1 Return to Konoha. Sasuke approached the village gates the same way he had done on several occasions over the past 3 years. Every time there was a rumor that Naruto had been spotted heading in the direction of Konoha, he would go to greet him. This wasn't because he was friends with the other boy, but because every day that Naruto was alive was a day that man's plans, or rather the plans of the criminal organization that man belonged to, weren't completed. That, and the fact that every time Naruto returned, he would have a new trick to show him. Too much had passed between him and Naruto in the early days back when he believed that the other boy was a stepping stone towards his goal of defeating that man for them to ever be friends. They could be friendly towards each other, but they had not crossed the line of friendship and likely never would. He himself wasn't without friends, however. After Naruto, Shino, and Shikamaru had been promoted to the rank of Chunin, he had been folded into Team 8 under Kurenai. He had been somewhat resentful of this at first, but had held his tongue around his team as there had been nothing he could do about the situation, especially after the Godame had refused his transfer request. It could have been worse, however, much worse. He could have been on Team 10 with Aino, for instance, or he could have been stupid enough to take the body snatcher Orochimaru up on his offer when his minions had turned up on his doorstep. After a while, When he realized that Hinata wasn't ever going to go all rabid fangirl on him since she was obsessed with Naruto of all people, he had begun opening up to her, and she became the first of his friends, the first true friend that he'd had since the massacre. Hinata was good if quiet company, had a wicked sense of humor when she chose to show it, and knew when to leave him alone. He'd had more difficulty warming up to Kiba, who reminded him of Naruto during their academy days, but warm up to him he did, especially after they'd saved each other's lives several times during missions after they'd been promoted to Chunin. Before he knew it, both of his teammates had wormed their way into his life and into his heart. Team 8, or Team Kurenai as it was now called since Hinata and Kiba were Chunin and he was a Tokubetsu Jounin, became for him what Team 7 should have been. Little Fugaku fussed as he shifted him to his other arm since he'd been getting heavy. He hadn't been quite ready to be a father when Fugaku was born last year, and frankly still wasn't. The Hokage had ordered Fugaku's conception as well as the conception of his two daughters Mikoto and Aiko after he had started taking dangerous missions so the Sharingan wouldn't die with him if he had the misfortune to die while he was away. He had little to no idea of who his children's mothers were as he'd merely supplied the genetic material that had been implanted, and had requested no contact with the women in case they decided to get any romantic notions, and tried to trap him in a situation where his only option aside from killing them was marrying them. He was not yet ready for marriage, and wasn't sure he would be any time soon. That wasn't to say he wasn't a family man when he had the time, much like many shinobi were. He did visit his children regularly while he was in Konoha, and had a system set up for that which involved the children being brought to a neutral and above all safe location where he would pick them up shortly after their mothers had dropped them off and left the room. Today was Fugaku's turn for a visit, and instead of doing something the child might find fun like he usually did on such visits, he was waiting for Naruto to return, and the wait had better be worth it. Eventually, after what had seemed to have been an eternity, he saw a spot of yellow on the horizon. Naruto had indeed returned today as had been expected. There had been times he hadn't, however, in order to throw off the Akatsuki and any other potential captors. As he watched, the spot of yellow became a wild thatch of hair, not that he could talk, atop the head of a small figure in the distance which steadily grew larger as Naruto approached. After the small figure grew to be human-sized as the distance between them closed, Naruto finally reached the gate several minutes after he first appeared. Upon spotting him standing near the gate as he signed in, Naruto paused for a moment and nodded. He nodded back, and Naruto continued on his way. His vigil over, he headed off to the park for some playtime on the swings before his visit with Fugaku was over and he had to return the boy to his mother who cared for him because she was in Konoha 24/7 unlike him. One day, maybe? But for now, that was the way things were, and they worked. Naruto was glad to be back in Konoha once again. Over the last 3 years, his returns to Konoha had been exceedingly sporadic, and he hadn't been allowed to stay long. Jiraiya had told him that this had been in order to keep both him and the village less at risk, as the Akatsuki would be less likely to attack Konoha to get him if they didn't have any idea whether or not he would be there. The Akatsuki could still attack Konoha while he was away, but without him there was less of a reason for them to do so, as it would be exceedingly unwise for a bunch of missing nin no matter how powerful to antagonize the villages without getting something big out of it in return. If they could manage to hold on to it, that was. After signing in at the gate and giving Sasuke his obligatory greeting, he smiled as he continued towards Ichiraku Ramen. When Kiba had first told him that Sasuke had pulled that stick out of his ass during one of his prior visits, he hadn't believed him. It had actually taken him a couple of visits which had included encounters with the bastard to accept Kiba's claim as true. Having kids had apparently helped significantly when it came to Sasuke's rectal stickectomy, as Sasuke seemed more relaxed and at peace with the world when he had one of his 3 brats in his arms. He was sure that the fact that Sasuke had brought one of his children near the gate when he'd waited for him was significant somehow, especially considering the number of kidnapping attempts that had been made since the first of the children had been born. As it was, there had been 5 ANBU discreetly hiding nearby when he'd arrived. The large number of ANBU had been a necessary precaution, since there couldn't be any risks taken with the Uchiha clan now, especially with Itachi still being on the loose, and Orochimaru supposedly still being obsessed with capturing Sasuke for some reason. Deciding to shelve the mystery of why Sasuke would get so close to the village gate with one of his precious offspring for later, he took his usual seat at his favorite ramen stand. He couldn't have picked a more opportune time to do so, since Iruka-sensei had been grabbing a quick lunch when he arrived, and had been happy to see him. After he'd finished his customary 15 bowls of ramen and Irika-sensei had gone his own way, he headed out in search of his friends and teammates, as he usually did shortly after he arrived on one of his all too short visits to the village of his birth. He soon found Suzume, Sakura, and Ino sparring at one of the training grounds. As soon as they registered his presence, they quickly broke up their three-way match to greet him. Suzume looked very much as she always did. Ino had changed her hairstyle sometimes since the last time he was back, and Sakura was wearing long sleeves, which was surprising considering the weather and the fact that she preferred to wear short-sleeved shirts and dresses. Of course, it would seem that Sakura had attained the goal that had been her reason for joining the Ninja Academy in the first place back before she'd filled her head with all of that nonsense about becoming Mrs. Uchiha. Short sleeves wouldn't be adequate to cover the tattoo. "Congratulations, Sakura," he said after all the greetings had been made and excited hugs exchanged between him, Suzume, and Sakura. The slight widening of the girl's eyes, and the swiftly aborted move her hand made towards her arm had been all of the confirmation he needed. Sakura was indeed to be congratulated, as she had proven herself to be one of the best shinobi in the village, as the best and those who had the potential to be the best were usually the ones who caught the Hokage's eye when it came to certain postings and assignments. After catching up on current events for a while, he, Suzume, Sakura, and Ino fell to sparring. Eventually they all fell to the grass either completely exhausted or feigning such. Sakura had shown phenomenal improvement since her days on Team 7, but that was to be expected considering her new status. "So, where's Satoshi?" he asked when the girls had all caught their breath. "He's at home," Suzume replied, looking worried for some reason. He'd heard that Satoshi had been having some problems, but they couldn't have gotten that bad, could they? He soon took his leave of the trio, and headed for Satoshi's house. There had been a time when he had not even been allowed to set foot on the front porch of his former teammate's home, but over the years, Satoshi's family had gradually allowed him inside, and had invited him to dine with them on a couple of occasions. Satoshi was upstairs in his room, sleeping of all things which, considering the looks that Satoshi's parents had been shooting at his door, was quite likely cause for concern. Satoshi eventually opened his door after a couple minutes of knocking, and hadn't looked too happy as he did so. Upon spotting him, Satoshi's mood rapidly changed from surly to extremely happy, and he pulled him into the room before shutting the door once more. As he seated himself on the only chair in the room, Satoshi started telling him what he'd been up to while he'd been gone. He frowned as he listened to Satoshi's tale of his most recent exploits. This was getting worrisome. Satoshi, as he learned soon after he joined the team, had always been a thief and a gambler, but it seemed to have gotten worse over the years. Now, it seemed that stealing and frequenting the gambling halls, both legal and not, was taking up all of his time outside of missions rather than the few hours a week it used to. The books and the rocks that Satoshi had so treasured when Naruto had first met him sat on their shelves untouched and gathering dust. Satoshi's skills with a sword had dulled as well, as he had seen when his friend had displayed a particularly fine weapon he'd won off of another shinobi in a foreign gaming hall. Someone who didn't know him probably wouldn't have noticed the last, but he'd known Satoshi for years, and because he'd known him for so long, the decrease in skill that seemed to be the result of a lack of practice was blatantly obvious. What had happened to his friend? When he joined Tetsuo-sensei and his family for dinner that evening, that had been one of the questions he'd asked. Tetsuo-sensei didn't know exactly what had happened to trigger it, but he had known what was going on with him, having seen several good shinobi become like Satoshi and worse over his career, his old friend Morishita included. Shinobi often indulged in various vices as a form of stress relief, and sometimes quite often in fact the shinobi would become addicted to said vices and they would start to control them, eating into training time and dulling their senses until they became a danger to both themselves and their teammates. There had been any number of cautionary tales attached to the reasons why a ninja shouldn't overindulge in the three shinobi vices, but it had taken seeing Satoshi as he was for them to finally be driven home. With youth comes a sense of immortality, and his hadn't faded quite yet despite the number of horrors he'd seen in his short life. He was glad to learn that Morishita-san, who had lost 2 of her genin in the Chunin exams in Kiri several years ago, had finally gotten help, and was getting herself clean and sober. Unfortunately, it was far too late for her to salvage her career, and it had been strongly suggested that she voluntarily retire before they removed her from the active duty roster themselves. Hopefully Satoshi would get help before something like that happened to him. He'd do his best to help his friend so he hopefully wouldn't turn out like Morishita, but he couldn't be around all the time, and if Satoshi didn't want help, there wasn't really all that much he could do for him. Despite the rarity of such visits and the levity that usually came with them, it was with a sad heart and a troubled mind that he bid his sensei goodnight and headed back to his apartment, which had lain vacant for several months. For several hours after he'd gone through his nightly routine and turned in for the night, he lay in bed unable to sleep. He would have to find a way to sleep somehow despite the thoughts that were preying upon him, though. Jiraiya had only given him today off, and had turned him loose while he went to report to the Hokage. Tomorrow, there would be training, and possibly missions. If he wasn't at the very least somewhat rested, he could become inattentive, and therefore a danger to himself and his teammates. But still, Satoshi. Chapter 2, On the Move. Sakura, or Raccoon rather, since she was on duty, smiled behind her mask as she watched Sasuke take little Aiko home after a day in the park. Aiko had started crawling recently, and with her new mobility had taken to getting into everything. The stories Aiko's guards related about the little holy terror never failed to get a laugh in the break room, and she wished the girl's mother luck, since that kid was most likely going to grow up to be a nightmare. An extremely spoiled nightmare at that, if Sasuke's behavior today was anything to judge by. She occasionally felt a pang of something when she saw Sasuke with his children, but today had rather fortunately not been one of those days. There had been a time when her life had revolved entirely around the illusion of the boy she'd held in her heart, but that time had passed, however, and she had grown up and moved on since then. If one day she and the real Sasuke, who was far more damaged than he let on and afraid to let anyone too close because of it, ended up together, so be it. If not, oh well. There were other fish in the sea. Soon she and her team were at the predetermined location at which Aiko's mother would retrieve her child. A medic was always present at these exchanges in case there were any complications. Today, it was her turn to be the medic. She liked this job better than most of the others she was called in for as a member of Konoha's Black Ops forces. Being an ANBU medic was difficult and dirty work, often far dirtier than anything another medic would face during their careers. There were times that she wondered what she was doing here, and if she should just quit. She couldn't, though. She had realized long ago that she had gone too far on her path to be able to do so. All of her friends were shinobi, and by the time her first Chunin exam had ended, she had seen and done far too much to be an ordinary civilian. Besides, if she quit now, she would have wasted all of the time and effort Shizen-sensei had put into making her the woman she was today. After a brief examination which revealed that Aiko was in perfect health as always, she handed the child over to her mother, who seemed surprisingly plain for a mother of a Uchiha. The woman wasn't ugly, but she was easily forgettable, and the color that best described her was brown. Brown hair, brown eyes, brown clothes, and tan skin. The woman was civilian due to the fact that she'd failed out of the academy, but most of her other relatives, including one of her ANBU guards, were shinobi. She herself had volunteered to be the mother of one of Sasuke's children before the faint flame she'd held for him had completely burned out, but she had been rejected on the basis of there being a possible Kekkai Genkai. Apparently, the naturally pink hair she'd been born with had counted against her. According to the story she'd heard later, the geneticist had taken one look at her picture, exclaimed, "That's natural?" and tossed her file into the reject pile without a second glance. She had been upset over the rejection at the time, and had cried for 3 days straight. Now, however, she didn't regret the fact that she'd been rejected. She wasn't ready for a child, and having a little life that depended on her for everything would have completely overwhelmed her. If she had had the child, and her dreams regarding Sasuke hadn't come true, she probably could have ended up hating it, which would have been completely unfair to said child. As Shizen-sensei had pointed out, it had been for the best. The woman, who was probably in her mid-20s, and her child were soon gone, and after she wrote up her report, it would be time for her to head to her next assignment. She'd dawdle over the report as long as she could, though, since she hated TNI clean-up duty. Naruto yawned and stretched after the last line of a particularly complex seal array was sketched in his notebook. He'd spent several hours tinkering with the damn thing, and now that he'd gotten it completely figured out, he would hand the information on it over to someone who would make good use of it. He would be doing that in the morning, though. He had something else he needed to do this evening. During the 3 years he'd been Jiraiya's apprentice, he'd learned a great deal. After he'd put his foot down about the whole Kyuubi issue, that was. Throughout his wanderings through numerous countries, he picked up several tricks that had made his traps even deadlier over the years. In fact, he'd earned himself an A-rank listing in a bingo book on the basis of his traps. Of course, as soon as someone realized that the mysterious trap master was him, and that he was the Kyubi Jinchuriki, the listing became more complete and got bumped up to S rank despite the fact that he was still a chunin. That had been a proud day as far as Jiraiya had been concerned, and the man had taken him on a week-long pub crawl to celebrate. What happened during that pub crawl was something he still wasn't entirely sure he could believe. Seeing as Konoha wasn't named village hidden in the awesome, the incident was either a dream, or there was a universe somewhere where the Shodai Hokage was a de-aged Uchiha Madara who had been mentally and physically 6 years old at the time he and Jiraiya left, or rather had fled from a massive posse that had been headed by a murderous Senju Hashirama who'd apparently actually been friends with Madara. As if that weren't too unbelievable in and of itself. As Jiraiya was a seal master, he would have had to have been incredibly dense if he hadn't learned anything in that area. He wasn't dense. While he was pretty much crap at making seals, that didn't mean he sucked at the subject. He was in fact one of the top seal breakers on the continent. He could break down and analyze seals that had left many in his field tearing their hair out in frustration in an amount of time that Jiraiya had said was ridiculously fast. Apparently, if the Uchiha were to be believed, he'd gotten his start in the academy when he'd ripped through the seals meant to keep students out of the teachers' lunches as if they weren't there, which, as far as he was concerned at the time, they weren't. Despite all this, he still hadn't managed to make heads or tails of the Hiraishin as Jiraiya had wanted him to, but it was only a matter of time before he did so. His business this evening had nothing to do with seals though, and everything to do with the third thing Jiraiya had taught him. After stretching once more, he got up and headed out. Out the door, out of the apartment building, down the road, and out of the village, nodding to the two chunin at the gate as he passed. About an hour later, he was in Shikuba town, and after a bit of wandering, he found a rather nice lady who quite happily joined him on his trip to the bar as he reflected on what his friends in Konoha would think of him if they saw him now. When he entered the somewhat seedy establishment, he saw someone he recognized from his travels. "Hey, Takara-san!" he called out to the man. "It's been a while. Mind if we join you?" Soon, he and his companion who had come to the town from her family's farm in order to let loose were seated across from the man Naruto had spotted. Throughout the evening, Naruto and his companions talked, drank, played cards, darts, and I never. Eventually, it was time for the bar to close, and Naruto and his lady friend made their way to a nearby inn. As soon as they reached their room, the woman fell asleep. As soon as Naruto was sure the woman was asleep, he pulled out the piece of paper that his contact had slipped into his pocket at the bar. As soon as he read it, his good mood swiftly evaporated. Orochimaru was planning something he was keeping close to his vest, and it involved Sasuke. When Orochimaru had seemingly given up on his former teammate nearly 3 years ago after the third recruiting team had been rather messily dispatched, he should have known it was too good to be true. Considering the amount of chaos and destruction Orochimaru could cause if he got his way when it came to Sasuke, he couldn't allow that to happen. He'd kill Sasuke first if it came to it. Orochimaru smiled as he called for one of his best subjects in order to give the young man a very special mission. In the 3 years since he'd tested Uchiha Sasuke, the boy had grown much stronger, and even more powerful, but he'd grown even more vulnerable as well. The boy now had quite the Achilles heel, and he would be exploiting that in order to get what he wanted, what the little Uchiha upstart had denied him 3 years before. Ordering Sasuke to create a new generation of Uchiha in case the worst should happen had been a smart move on Tsunade's part. In fact, though he hadn't originally planned to do so, he himself had done what he could to help, and had one of his agents in Konoha get a hold of a certain set of samples, which had been surprisingly easy to do. Uchiha Sasuke now had 7 children in Otogekure. As soon as his subordinate's mission was complete, there would be 8. He had considered using the 7 children he had on hand in order to lure Sasuke to him, but he knew the Uchiha boy well enough to know that he wouldn't risk anything for a bunch of possibly fictional children he never laid eyes on before. He would be willing to risk everything for a child that he developed an emotional attachment to, however. Soon, one of the rising stars of his forces was kneeling before him. He wasn't of the elite, but he was close to getting there, and would be counted amongst the elite should he successfully complete this mission. "Orochimaru-sama, I live to serve," the man who was only just on this side of humans said. "My life is yours to do with as you see fit." "Good," he replied, "since there is a strong chance that you won't be returning from this mission. If you do, however, the reward shall be great." "What would you have me do?" the man asked. "I want you to go to Konoha and retrieve one of Uchiha Sasuke's children, preferably the son. You are to bring the child back here completely unharmed," he replied. Not unnecessarily wasting any time, the Jounin bowed and left to prepare for his mission. Soon, Sasuke, he said. Soon I shall have your body, and those eyes. The wait had better be worth it. He had invested time and materials in Sasuke that he could ill afford to spend in the here and now, despite the fact that one had to use resources in order to gain more for the future. The reason he wasn't destroying Konoha at the moment was because one of his experiments involving viruses had caused an epidemic that had wiped out nearly half of his forces. It was all he could do to keep Sun out. The fact that the bastards were picking his men off every time they came across them in the field was bad enough. Kamiya Satoshi yelped in more in shock than in pain. He had set foot in the front door of his favorite Konoha gambling hall, and had nearly been electrocuted when he did so. What the hell was that? He yelled. The retired ninja who was currently employed as a bouncer looked slightly sheepish as he handed him a slip of paper. Your blonde friend asked me to give this to you, the man said. He looked down at the paper. Satoshi, I know that you are going to hate me and probably want to kill me, but I can't stand by and do nothing while you throw your life and career away. I've put seals on all of the gambling halls in Konoha in order to keep you out in hopes that you'll use your time accordingly. Naruto, he growled as he crumpled the paper into a ball. He was going to kill that brat. It was his life, and he'd live it however he wanted to. If he wanted to spend all of his free time gambling, then he would do so. It wasn't anyone's job to dictate to him what he should and shouldn't do, especially not Naruto. Danzo sighed as he wiped the vomit off of his clothing. He hated this part of child rearing. It was one of the reasons he tended to select orphans rather than have some of his root operatives breed more of them to replace the losses. Considering the fact that he had the room and the resources and the time, he could have easily done so had he so chosen, however. Part of the reason that his forces were so loyal to him was that he created an attachment to him early on before the training meant to eliminate all emotion kicked in. He became something of a father figure to those who had no parents before he became their master. The problem with this particular recruit who was currently undergoing the attachment conditioning was that since there had been no orphan Uchiha besides the closely watched Uchiha Sasuke, he'd had to breed his own. That meant that this recruit was still in diapers, and prone to vomiting on people. The attachment, and therefore loyalty to him, must be formed and as early as possible, however. Take this back to the nursery, he said as he handed Uchiha number 4 off to his nearest agent. He'd had enough for one day. He was going to bed. Chapter 3, Taken. Naruto yawned as he entered the gate. It was fortunate that he was still cleared for travel, or his work with Jiraiya's spy network, which would one day be his spy network, would be a great deal harder to get done. He didn't care for all of the drinking this particular job required, but a great deal of good information was found in bars and other such establishments, and they were a good place to meet contacts without arousing suspicion. Fortunately, thanks to the Kyuubi, he had a much higher alcohol tolerance than normal. Along with handing over yesterday's sealing work, he would have to give the intelligence department a heads up. For what, though, he did not yet know, other than the fact that it somehow involved the Uchiha. As he made his way to his apartment, he was ambushed by a furious Satoshi. It seemed that his friend had gotten his note then. He was too tired to deal with this now, but it seemed that he would have to. What the hell, Satoshi? He yelled as he pushed his enraged teammate off of him. You had no right! No right at all, you stinking hypocrite! Satoshi yelled back as he tried to wail on him again. Hypocrite? He asked. What? You don't think I can't smell the booze and perfume on you? Satoshi replied. Apparently you can have a good time whenever the hell you want to, but when someone else tries. There's a difference between letting loose once in a while and doing what you've been doing, Satoshi, he replied with a sigh. This was going to be a long morning, and he still needed to write up his report. The man who currently called himself Toby when he wasn't passing himself off as his relative Uchiha Madara, to the point that he actually thought of himself as Madara and completely forgot who he was if he was anyone at all, at times smiled behind his mask as he gave a stick of dango to a hungry-looking child who had the slightly feral look of an untended orphan about him. Despite the fact that he was what most people considered evil, he had a bit of a soft spot when it came to children. It probably came from the fact that he'd raised a few of his own little monsters in between missions for Madara back when the original was still around to forward his own plans. Some stuff could be left on its own back then. He wasn't the only Toby, nor was he the first. Madara had needed and would need several people in several critical places in order to properly bring his plans to fruition. The old falconer's habit of naming his Uchiha assistants after common black kites raised eyebrows amongst those who knew the nicknames some militaries had given them, but the name made sense in a way. Like many Uchiha, shithawks would steal everything on your plate if you didn't watch the damn things. Zetsu likely existed to be his and his cousin's watcher, and to wave them off if it looked like they were about to snatch something from Madara's currently unattended plate. He wouldn't steal off of Madara's plate, however. He had too much riding on the Moon's Eye plan, more than the other and younger of the two remaining Toby, who likely would have gotten over his little girlfriend long ago if he weren't bats hit insane and possibly brain damaged. It wasn't really in his nature anyway, considering all he'd wanted and what he'd been denied by his own clan, whom he'd helped slaughter with his much younger cousins who'd been mostly unaware of his work, was a peaceful life. He was more of a behind-the-scenes Toby, and would soon be a retired Toby, since his younger cousin, who'd once been a boy named Obito, would be the one who'd be joining Madara on the battlefield, since he had the skills and raw power to do so, the skills and sheer power he lacked for the most part. Despite the fact that he wasn't the only one, being Toby was fun. While he was Toby, especially since the younger one had come on the scene, he could be happy-go-lucky, and he didn't have to remember. No, he wouldn't. That way lay even more madness. Currently, Toby was in a small town in Fire Country between Konoha and the Rice Country border, a town that he felt would hold something of interest in a few hours. He'd never promised Itachi that he'd stay out of Fire Country entirely after all, just that he would stay out of Konoha, though Itachi was unlikely to realize the reason he'd been given such a promise twice had been because he and his younger cousin had switched out when the younger one had gone off to stamp out some fire that had sprung up in Kiri while he'd been away training the young boy. Since they had been careful not to switch out around the boy too often, Itachi had thought him to be the other Toby with his disguise removed, because young Obito had kept a seal-based illusion that had put out a false chakra signature up while with the boy who had known him as a toddler, and he was closer to the age Madara would have been. Being as old as he was, he had looked positively ancient to such young eyes. Considering that he was a man of his word, he would remain outside Konoha's borders for as long as Itachi was alive. As soon as Itachi was dead, however, all bets were off. Itachi was no Madara, and Madara had been the only one to earn his undying loyalty. As he stood there wool-gathering, the child he'd given the dango to ran off before he could change his mind about the gift, and started scarfing it down on the fly. That was maybe 2 minutes killed until it was time, and he had several hours to go. Perhaps he could visit the local onsen. A nice soak would be good for relieving stress and that twinge in his back. Since he hadn't had half his body replaced like his younger cousin had, there'd be little to no comment if he did so. He wouldn't really need to be in top form for what he knew to be coming, but it would be best not to risk getting caught with his pants down. Having his back go out at the most inopportune moment would put quite the crimp in his plans. Getting old sucked, and if the other alternative hadn't been death, he wouldn't have recommended it. The man smiled as he carried the sleeping bundle over the wall. It had been all too easy. In the 3 years of peace since the invasion, Konoha had softened back up again and began to get lax in their security measures once more. Patrol routes had become predictable again, and the shinobi who stood guard on them less alert. Despite the fact that he wasn't exactly one of the elite, he had managed to kill the ANBU guard around his target's house without raising an alarm. He had then made his way into the home of a young kunoichi who was currently on maternity leave for an indefinite period of time, a kunoichi who was both mother and guard to his target. He killed the young woman and made his way to the apartment's second bedroom in which his target was kept. The apartment's second bedroom had been made up into a nursery with pale blue walls and ridiculous-looking stuffed animals. Oddly enough, one of the animals was a weasel in a ninja costume. A rather strange choice of decoration and childhood plaything considering what the infant's uncle had done. Perhaps the young woman didn't care for the child nearly as much as she pretended to. It didn't matter now, the mother was dead, and the child would never see this place again. As he raced home, he kept his attention focused behind him, ever alert for signs of pursuit. It is perhaps because he was so focused on what might be behind that he didn't realize what might be before could be a problem until he ran into someone halfway between Konoha and home. "I'm sorry, Ninja-san, but I can't allow you to go any further." The man in the orange mask, black sweatshirt with armor plates, black pants, white gaiters, black sandals, gray gloves, and long green scarf said. The man's words sounded playful, but there seemed to be something underneath. Something that gave him the chills. He learned exactly what that something was when he found himself trapped in a nightmarish genjutsu world for the last few seconds before he died. For him, it seemed like days, but The elder and soon-to-be retired since his part in things was almost finished Toby did his best to comfort the infant, as he wiped the Oto Jounen's blood off of him. He knew exactly who the infant was, and who he belonged to. The original Uchiha Fugaku had been quite the bastard, which was pretty much par for the course in the clan, though there were a few standouts like himself and his young cousins. The man's son didn't seem quite as arrogant as his father had been if the stories he'd heard about the boy were true though. If the stories he'd heard about Uchiha Sasuke were true, the boy had become infected with that damnable Senju's will of fire, which immediately made him an unfit parent in his book. There was no way in hell he'd let the first generation of what was to be the new Uchiha clan be infected with the Senju's philosophies. Besides, the Uchiha owed him a child and so much more. The first sign of trouble had been the silence, then the scent of smoke on the air. He knew what burning human flesh smelled like. He had smelled it in almost every battle in which he'd ever been involved before he'd retired to make his home, and be with his family whom he'd faked his death for. That smell should not be lingering near the place he called home, however. There had been a reason that he had gone along with the slightly squeamish Obito who hadn't quite been ready to destroy Konoha though he'd said otherwise and accepted Itachi's deal, and got revenge on the Uchiha in exchange for Konoha's temporary survival. He had as much reason, in fact more reason than Madara, to get revenge on his clan. The Uchiha's policies regarding bastards had taken everything from him. He had paid them back in blood. Blood for blood. 10 for every one taken from him. 10 for his wife, 10 for each of his 2 sons, 10 for his daughter, 10 for the wife of his eldest, 10 for each of his 3 small grandchildren. In truth, though he'd mostly done his work quietly and in the background, he had been responsible for the slaughter of the bulk of the Uchiha clan. Those Obito hadn't killed, the boy assumed Itachi had done since he wasn't even supposed to be in the area that night, and those Itachi hadn't killed he assumed Obito had done. Though almost completely extinct, the Uchiha still owed him a great deal, more than his 3 surviving kinsmen could repay. The child he just rescued from the Oto Nin would cover a small part of that repayment. "Come on, little one, let's find us a new home, and a better name for you than Fugaku," the elder Toby said as he swaddled the infant whose cries had finally quieted in his scarf. The scarf would have to do until he found the child a suitable blanket. He would be gone a great deal of the time on business as there was still work to be done until it was time for Obito and Madara to bring the Jibi together, and his new child would likely spend most of his time with a minder, but he would find a way to come back to whatever home he chose often enough to bring his new heir up right. This time, there were no Uchiha left to bring down his sons and daughter, no Uchiha to trap his wife, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren inside their family home before burning it down and leaving a warning for the clansmen dumb enough to spawn offspring outside of the clan and village. Obito would soon be going to war whether or not the plan they had dedicated decades to succeeded. Itachi was dying of illness, and the boy who was now more Senju than Uchiha would stay his hand out of love for his offspring if he ever did learn the child was alive and discover his whereabouts. This time, his child would live to grow up and start a new Uchiha clan, a better Uchiha clan under the watchful eye of the moon where his older siblings and his niece and nephews would be waiting along with every other loved one who'd passed on. Sasuke turned pale as he heard the news. No. 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 This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be happening. Who would do this? Why would they do this? Could it have been Itachi? If it was, why now? Why just one of them when he could get all of them? Was he just going to take them one at a time to watch him suffer as he was helpless to stop him as he had been back then? Naruto had warned him earlier that Orochimaru had planned on doing something to him because he'd rejected him 3 years ago. Had it been Orochimaru who'd taken his son because he hadn't joined him? Was this Orochimaru's revenge? Had it been someone else? The Sharingan was rare and valuable, and with most of the clan being infants, they were at their most vulnerable. In the end, it didn't matter who did it. His Fugaku was gone. Taken. All he could hope was that his child was alive somewhere, since there was no blood and no note telling him where he could find the body. Chapter 4: Methods of Coping. Orochimaru shifted impatiently as he waited. Considering how late it was getting, the possibility that the ninja he'd sent out to kidnap Sasuke's son had run into trouble between Konoha and here grew. News that the first part of the mission was successful had arrived long before. The shinobi he'd sent out had yet to do so as well, however. Otogekyo was 3 days away from Konoha as a genin or freshly minted chunin could travel, but FO a jounin, especially one that was as heavily modified as the one he'd sent out, That travel time could be brought down to a day or less if they were going full tilt as someone who'd managed to successfully kidnap one of the Uchiha infants should be. The only things he could think that could have gone wrong was that Danzo, who was keeping a stable of his own little Uchiha pets, had gotten wind of his plans and decided to add another to his batch while the location of the only Uchiha son was still in question. He would have heard if other villages had gotten wind of his plans, as the results would have been rather messy, and likely would have ended up with the infant dead in the struggle over it. Kidnapping Sasuke's offspring wasn't the only plan he had in his arsenal when it came to getting Sasuke's Sharingan, but it was one of the easiest, and since the time to change bodies was coming soon. People wondered why he didn't give up on Sasuke, but the truth was, Sasuke was just about his only possible means of acquiring the Sharingan since Danzo guarded that arm and stole an eye of his jealously. Trying Itachi again would just be suicide on a stick, and the same went for Tobi, both the more public Tobi who had controlled the Mizukage and the Akatsuki and the more private Tobi who tended to vanish into the background as if he were never there quietly doing things that supposedly furthered Madara's plans, completely oblivious to the fact that Uchiha Madara was long since dead and gone. Seeing as there was no second option, and no alternative, it would appear that he would have to do something more direct in order to acquire Sasuke. Perhaps if he let slip that he was the reason that the boy's son had been taken. The Uchiha would do anything for revenge after all. Uchiha Sasuke felt numb as he entered the mission assignment room. He knew that would soon change, however, after the shock wore off and the reality of the situation set in. He would have to be away from Konoha when that happened, far away, or there's no telling what he might do. Based on past experience, he knew that he would either turn his anger inward or outward. If he turned it inward, he might possibly do something that could destroy him. If he turned it outward, there was a possibility that with his current skill level he could go on a killing spree that could make the Uchiha massacre seem almost tame in comparison by the time the village shinobi managed to contain him and bring him down. He was going to need to kill something soon, and it would be best if it wasn't a citizen of Konoha. Not because he particularly liked or cared for Konoha, but because it would be nearly impossible for him and his to live here if he did. While not absolute, as was illustrated by the disappearance of his son, Konoha provided a measure of protection that he would not be able to have out on his own. Were he on his own, he would have to look over his shoulder every second of every day, and he would not have guards to relieve him so he could rest, or helpers that could deal with the more mundane tasks so he could focus on protecting his children. "I want the highest ranked mission you can give me," he said when he reached the mission assignment desk, which was currently being manned by that pair of gate ninja he'd occasionally seen doing odd jobs around the village. "The one on the right, Kotatsu?" Kotetsu winced slightly. Apparently, they'd been given orders regarding just such a situation. "I'm sorry, but I can't give you anything higher than AC, Hokage's orders," the man said, confirming his suspicions. "Do any of the currencies include killing?" he asked. One of the numerous bandit clearing missions that cropped up every once in a while when people's greed overrode their sense of self-preservation, or people simply got desperate enough that the thought of ninjas coming to kill them no longer frightened them since they had no other option, was slid across the desk towards him. Knowing that it was the best he could get under the circumstances, he took it, read the particulars, signed off on it, marking it as a solo job, and left. All too soon, he was past the village gates and on the road. Many would think him cold and callous for leaving the village so soon after his son had been taken rather than gathering his other children all the closer and spending every moment with them that he could in case something happened to them, but it was because he didn't want something to happen to them that he was leaving. He knew that his mental and emotional state was precarious at the moment, and if he didn't get his head screwed on straight, it was entirely possible that he would do something he'd regret, do something like what that one cousin of his did to make sure that nobody would ever hurt her children. He passed by those 3 small graves every time he visited those of his parents. Naruto blamed himself. If he'd given the rumor, which had been the result of an actual security leak, and had actually been important, more credence rather than mentally cataloging it with the others regarding Orochimaru and Sasuke, which hadn't really panned out, the village would have been on higher alert, several ANBU would still be alive, and Sasuke's son would be in the village right now. As he sat there going back over and over the manner in which he'd reported the rumor he'd gotten from his informant rather than decoding the seal that Jiraiya had given him, he wondered which words he'd used that had caused it to be marked down as not serious. He'd been rather tired, and put out from having to deal with Satoshi, who thought he'd been having fun despite the fact that drinking and hooking up with people hadn't been one of his favorite pastimes when he'd turned up at the intelligence department. Had it been the grumbling manner in which he'd delivered his report which had marked it as low priority? Had it been the fact that the information was rather vague in and of itself? Takaru had done his best to get what little he could. The traveler who often made forays into the smaller countries and had his finger on the pulse of such places as a matter of survival had come through for Jiraiya and Konoha in turn in the past. This time, however, he had failed through no fault of his own. What little information he'd gathered, which was what little there was to be had simply been too little too late, especially because a total ditz who should have realized that it was more significant than the usual threats, had completely failed to deliver it in a way that would cause it to be taken seriously, mainly because he himself hadn't taken it all that seriously. Because he'd failed and had been more focused on his minor discomforts, several good shinobi had lost their lives, and Sasuke's son had been taken to parts unknown, parts that could quite possibly be Orochimaru's lair where he would be kept for nefarious purposes. Jiraiya had warned him something like this could happen, told him that something like this had happened to him several times before, but did he listen to him? No. Instead, he'd stood there and told the man that he was mature enough to be responsible for at least part of his spy network, which was obviously not the case as this situation clearly illustrated. He couldn't give the responsibility back, however, because the instant he'd lightened the old pervert's load, the bastard went and just about overextended himself, taking on extra responsibilities that he wouldn't be able to manage if he dumped his share of the load back on his shoulders. Jiraiya may have been legendary when it came to his strength and skill, but he wasn't getting any younger, and even the strongest of men had a breaking point. Considering what he'd already survived, he wondered what his would be. Raccoon barely held back her tears as she signed the last of the documents regarding the autopsy of one of a half-dozen ANBU who had been casualties of Uchiha Fugaku's kidnapping. With this signature, Rabbit's file would be closed out, the body of a young man who was only a year and change older than her would be returned to its family, and a mask would be up for reassignment. In a week or two, there would be a new rabbit with a new paint job, and it wouldn't be the rabbit she knew, the rabbit who'd occasionally joked with her in the ANBU break room when he noticed that she was feeling out of her element as rookie ANBU were wont to do. She didn't envy the Hokage the responsibility of having to fill vacancies in her forces, especially in this day and age when, except for a lucky few who'd had the drive to do extra training and had the right mentors to help them on their way, the shinobi candidates she'd seen were so unqualified it wasn't even funny. If she didn't know any better, she'd say the academy curriculum had been sabotaged, but since it was the same as what she'd studied back when she was in the academy, that couldn't possibly be the case. After signing the form that released the former rabbit's body to his relatives, she delivered the file to administration, who'd deliver it to the Hokage, whom she rarely ever saw even though she was ANBU and therefore had theoretically been picked by her to serve her needs and answer only to her. Once the file had been delivered, she headed back to ANBU headquarters where she shucked her equipment and had a much-needed shower. Once out of the shower, she signed out for the evening, hoping to find comfort in the one place that hadn't yet let her down, though there had been a time or two that she'd wanted to strangle its inhabitants. "What's wrong, Sakura?" a worried Haruno Barako asked her daughter as she came through the door. "Just work stuff," Sakura replied as she seated herself at the table, despite the fact that it wasn't mealtime, and she wasn't really in the mood to eat. Omekabito had made his speech, exhorting Naruto to join him, and was holding his hand out, awaiting the boy's answer. Naruto was barely paying attention to his father's former student, however, as he seemingly only had eyes for someone else, namely the other man standing on the head of the jubi. "Are you really Madara?" Naruto asked. "Yes," the resurrected Uchiha Madara replied. "Are you really Madara and not just another Toby like that old dude Wash's name?" Naruto asked. Twin mutters of, "I thought he died," came from the Uchiha following that question. "Yes, I'm really Madara," Madara replied, wondering if having his minions going around using his name had really been all that bright of an idea now that he thought of it. "Great!" Naruto said cheerfully before pulling a storage scroll from his vest pocket and pulling out a battered copy of a treatise on traps. "Can you sign my book?" Naruto asked.